Welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting into the shadowed origins of Five Nights at Freddy's most infamous figure. A man whose name has become synonymous with calculated cruelty, mechanical innovation, and an obsession with immortality that would shatter countless innocent lives. William Afton, the Purple Guy, Springtrap, a serial killer whose crimes against children created the haunted legacy that defines this entire franchise. But before the yellow rabbit suit, before the missing children, before the murders that would trap souls in metal and wire, there was simply a man. And somewhere in that man's past, in the years before Fredbear's family diner, before his partnership with Henry Emily, before everything went so catastrophically wrong, something happened, something that planted the seeds of what he would become. The question that has haunted the Five Nights at Freddy's community since the beginning is deceptively simple, yet impossibly complex. What created William Afton? Was he born with something fundamentally broken inside him? Some absence of empathy that made childhood cruelty as natural as breathing? Or did something happen to him? Some trauma or loss or moment of realization that twisted whatever humanity he possessed into the cold, calculating monster who could look into a child's eyes and see nothing more than a means to an end? The answer, frustratingly and perhaps appropriately for a series built on mystery and speculation, is that we simply don't know. Scott Cawthon, the creator of Five Nights at Freddy's, has given us pieces of William Afton's adult life, fragments of his crimes, glimpses of his descent into madness and his obsessive quest for eternal life. But his childhood, those formative years that shape every human being, remain largely shrouded in darkness. And perhaps that's intentional. Perhaps the horror of William Afton is more effective precisely because we can't point to a single moment and say, "There, that's when he broke. That's when the monster was born." Real monsters, after all, rarely come with origin stories that make sense. Real serial killers, the John Wayne Gacys and Jeffrey Dahmers who inspired aspects of Afton's character, often had childhoods that seemed disturbingly normal on the surface, with the darkness hidden beneath layers of suburban respectability. Or they had childhoods marked by abuse and neglect, yet millions of people experience similar trauma without becoming killers. The relationship between childhood and monstrosity is never simple, never straightforward, and the absence of a clear backstory for William Afton forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about evil. Sometimes it doesn't make sense. Sometimes there is no satisfying explanation. Sometimes the monster is just a monster. But that doesn't mean we can't examine what we do know. While William Afton's childhood remains a mystery, we have substantial information about his adult personality, his relationships, his methods, and his psychology. We can work backwards from the monster to theorize about the man, using the fragments Scott has given us across the games, the novel trilogy, and now the film adaptation to build a psychological profile. We can look at the real-world serial killers who inspired him and understand the patterns of thinking that lead someone to view other human beings, especially children, as objects to be used and discarded. We can examine his relationship with Henry Emily, the contrast between them, and consider how jealousy and resentment towards someone who seemed to have everything Afton lacked might have fed the darkness inside him. We can study his family dynamics, the way he neglected and abused his own children, and ask what kind of childhood would produce a father so fundamentally incapable of love. This exploration won't give us definitive answers. The Five Nights at Freddy's lore has always been about piecing together fragments, about speculation and theory rather than explicit exposition. but by examining every piece of canon information we have. By analyzing William Afton's psychology and comparing it to real-world parallels, by studying his relationships and actions, we can begin to understand the contours of the void at his center. We can map the shape of the absence where empathy and human connection should exist. We can trace the evolution from whoever he was before to the monster who would don a yellow rabbit suit and lure children to their deaths with a smile. So whether you're here to actively engage with this analysis, to let these details wash over you as you drift towards sleep, or simply to deepen your understanding of Five Nights at Freddy's most complex villain, settle in. We're going to spend the next hours examining William Afton, not just as a collection of murders and mechanical innovations, but as a human being, or at least something that once was human. We'll look at what the novels tell us, what the games suggest, what his voice and accent might reveal, and what his relationships with Henry Emily and his own family demonstrate about the kind of person he was. We'll explore the psychology of serial killers, the patterns that mark someone as fundamentally different from the rest of humanity, and we'll consider whether those patterns were always present in William Afton, or whether they emerged over time, cultivated by circumstances we can only guess at. The story of William Afton is ultimately a story about the banality of evil, about how monsters can hide in plain sight, wearing the mask of a successful businessman, a skilled engineer, a father of three. It's about how innovation and intelligence do not equal morality, how someone can be brilliant and creative and utterly devoid of conscience. It's about how the absence of something, the lack of empathy that should be a fundamental part of human psychology, can create a void that gets filled with obsession and cruelty. And it's about how we, as observers trying to understand, must confront the possibility that some questions don't have satisfying answers, that sometimes evil simply exists, and the childhood that created it remains forever out of reach, forever unknowable, forever hidden in the shadows where monsters are born. The challenge of canon, what we know versus what we don't. Before we can meaningfully discuss William Afton's childhood and origins, we need to establish something crucial about Five Nights at Freddy's as a franchise. The lore is fragmented, intentionally, deliberately, brilliantly fragmented. Scott Cawthon built this series on the foundation of mystery, of hidden details tucked into minigames and newspaper clippings, of theories and speculation, and the community coming together to piece together a narrative from scattered fragments. This approach has created one of the most engaged and dedicated fandoms in gaming, but it also creates a significant challenge when we try to discuss something as specific as a character's backstory. What is canon? What counts as reliable information? When we have multiple versions of events across different mediums, which one do we trust? The Five Nights at Freddy's universe exists across several distinct continuities. We have the original game series, which tells its story primarily through gameplay, minigames, and environmental storytelling. We have the novel trilogy, beginning with The Silver Eyes, written by Scott Cawthon and Kira Breed-Risley, which presents an alternate timeline with different events but similar characters. We have the Fazbear Frights short story collections, which contain stories that may or may not be directly canon, but which often provide insight into concepts that appear in the games. We have the film adaptation, which creates yet another interpretation of these events. And now we're seeing the Steel Wool era of games, including Help Wanted, Security Breach, and Ruin, which continue the story, but also introduce new complications and contradictions. When it comes to William Afton specifically, this fragmentation becomes particularly pronounced. In the games, he appears primarily as the purple guy, a sprite-based character whose motivations remain largely mysterious until much later in the series. His voice doesn't appear until Sister Location, where PJ Haywood gives him that distinctive British accent that would become so associated with the character. His physical appearance is never clearly shown in the games themselves, leaving us to extrapolate from pixelated minigame sprites and the decayed horror of Springtrap. His backstory, his childhood, his life before Fredbear's family diner, all of it remains almost entirely unaddressed in the game continuity. We get glimpses of his adult life, his role as co-founder of Fazbear Entertainment, his partnership with Henry Emily, his family, but nothing about where he came from or what made him this way. The novel trilogy gives us more, but with the caveat that it's explicitly an alternate universe. The Silver Eyes, the Twisted Ones, and the Fourth Closet present a version of William Afton, who shares many characteristics with his game counterpart, but exists in a different timeline with different events. This version of Afton is described physically in ways the games never are. He starts as a heavy-set man with a jovial demeanor, described as having the ruddy geniality of a financially shrewd Santa Claus, someone who appeared to be the normal one compared to the withdrawn and shadowy Henry Emily. But over time, particularly after his first Springlock accident, he becomes gaunt and sallow, losing weight until his clothes hang off him, his appearance reflecting the decay of whatever humanity he might have once possessed. This version of Afton keeps journals, multiple stacks of them, obsessively documenting his fixation on Henry Emily. He's described as being jealous of Henry's inventive genius, wanting what Henry has, resenting Henry's stable family life and his daughter Charlie. But here's the critical question. Can we use information from the novels to understand the game version of William Afton? Scott Cawthon has stated that the novels should be viewed as separate from the games, existing in their own continuity. However, he's also indicated that the books can help fill in gaps in understanding, that they explore similar themes and character dynamics, even if the specific events differ. So when the novels show us a William Afton, who's jealous of Henry, who has an unhealthy obsession with his business partner, who views children as objects to be used in his experiments, are we seeing insights into the game version's psychology, or are we seeing a completely different character who just happens to share a name? The approach this exploration will take is to acknowledge the distinction between continuities while recognizing that all versions of William Afton likely share certain core characteristics. Scott Cawthon doesn't accidentally create consistent patterns across different media. When we see jealousy of Henry Emily appearing in both the novels and suggested in the games, when we see a pattern of viewing his own children as expendable tools appearing across continuities, when we see the same obsession with overcoming death and achieving immortality regardless of which version we're examining. These consistencies tell us something meaningful about who William Afton is at his core. They're not accidents of storytelling, but deliberate character traits that define him across all his incarnations. What we know definitively about William Afton's origins from the games is remarkably sparse. We know he co-founded Fazbear Entertainment with Henry Emily sometime in the 1970s, with Fredbear's Family Diner opening by 1983, based on the timeline established in later games. We know he had a family, a wife whose fate remains unknown, and 3 children, Michael, Elizabeth, and a younger son commonly referred to by the community as the crying child. though his official name has never been revealed. We know he was skilled with animatronics and robotics, though whether this was something Henry taught him or a skill he brought to the partnership is never explicitly stated, though both the games and novels suggest Henry was the true innovator, while William handled business and finances. We know he designed the fun-time animatronics with their hidden child-killing mechanisms, suggesting his murderous intent was premeditated rather than impulsive. We know he became a serial killer who targeted children, luring them with the Spring Bonnie costume to commit murders that would eventually trap their souls in the animatronics. But about his life before all of this, about his childhood, his adolescence, what he was like as a young man before meeting Henry Emily, about what might have happened to him to create someone capable of looking into a child's terrified eyes and feeling nothing but clinical interest in how their death might serve his purposes. The games tell us nothing. The novels tell us nothing. The film tells us nothing. This absence is itself significant. It's a deliberate choice on Scott's part, and we need to respect that even as we theorize about what might fill that void. What we can say with confidence is that William Afton, regardless of continuity, displays certain consistent psychological traits that typically develop in childhood and adolescence. His complete lack of empathy, his view of other people as objects or obstacles rather than fellow humans, his grandiose sense of his own intelligence and importance, his manipulative charm that allows him to present a facade of normalcy, his obsessive need for control, his inability to form genuine emotional connections even with his own children. All of these are characteristics that don't suddenly appear in adulthood. They have roots, and those roots go deep into a person's formative years. Serial killers in the real world, the ones who inspired aspects of Afton's character, often show warning signs in childhood: cruelty to animals, fascination with fire, bedwetting into later childhood, the so-called McDonald triad that some criminologists have pointed to as potential indicators. Many display early signs of conduct disorder, a childhood pattern of violating social norms and the rights of others. They often have difficulty forming normal attachments, showing what psychologists call a reactive attachment disorder stemming from neglect or abuse in their earliest years. They may be intelligent, even charming, but there's something missing, some fundamental capacity for human connection that never developed properly. Did young William Afton torture animals? Did he set fires? Did he display the kind of callous disregard for others that would predict his future crimes? We can speculate, but we can't know. What we can know is that the William Afton we encounter in the games and novels displays psychological characteristics that typically have childhood origins. The question is whether those origins involve trauma that broke him, or whether he was simply born without something essential, without that spark of empathy that makes most humans recoil from causing suffering in others. The challenge of discussing William Afton's childhood is ultimately the challenge of discussing the absence of information. We're trying to illuminate darkness with a flashlight that only shows us what's nearby, leaving the vast majority of his past hidden in shadows. But shadows themselves tell us something. The shape of what's missing can be as informative as what's present. The fact that Scott Cawthon chose not to give us William Afton's childhood, chose not to provide a neat origin story that would explain and perhaps excuse his actions, tells us that the horror of this character lies partly in that absence. We're not meant to sympathize. We're not meant to understand in the way that understanding might lead to forgiveness. We're meant to confront a void where humanity should be, and recognize that sometimes monsters don't need a tragic backstory to justify their existence. In the sections that follow, we'll examine what we can piece together from the fragments we have. We'll look at the novels as a window into possible psychological patterns, even if the specific events differ from the games. We'll analyze his relationships, particularly with Henry Emily, and consider what they reveal about his character. We'll explore the real-world psychology of serial killers and see how it maps onto what we observe in William Afton's behavior. We'll trace his evolution from whoever he was before to the monster in the yellow suit, and we'll acknowledge throughout that we're working with speculation informed by careful analysis rather than definitive answers. Because in the world of Five Nights at Freddy's, definitive answers are rare, and perhaps the most disturbing answer is that sometimes there is no answer at all. The novel trilogy, our deepest glimpse. If we want to understand William Afton's psychology and get as close as we can to exploring his origins, the novel trilogy remains our richest source of character detail. While Scott Cawthon has been clear that the Silver Eyes, the Twisted Ones, and the Fourth Closet exist in an alternate timeline from the games, he's also indicated that these books can help us understand the broader themes and character dynamics of the Five Nights at Freddy's universe. The novels give us a version of William Afton with interiority, with thoughts and motivations that are explored in ways the games never attempt. They show us his relationships in detail, particularly his complex and toxic dynamic with Henry Emily. They give us physical descriptions and personality traits that help us visualize a complete human being, rather than a purple sprite or a decayed animatronic. And while we must always caveat that this is novel Afton, not game Afton, the psychological patterns revealed in these books likely reflect core aspects of who William Afton is, across all continuities. The physical transformation of novel William Afton is itself revealing. When he first appears in flashbacks to the early days of Fredbear's family diner, he's described as robust and lively, a heavy-set man with ruddy skin and a jovial demeanor. He has the appearance of a successful businessman, someone who exudes confidence and financial acumen. The description specifically notes that he seemed like the normal one compared to Henry Emily, who was more withdrawn and shadowy in his mannerisms. This external presentation of normality is crucial to understanding William Afton. He wasn't obviously sinister. He didn't wear his monstrosity on his sleeve. Instead, he was charming, successful, the kind of person you'd trust with your business, and maybe even with your children. This ability to present a facade of trustworthiness is fundamental to how he operated, both in building Fazbear Entertainment and in luring his victims. But the novels show us how this facade begins to crack physically, even as his true nature becomes more evident. After his first Springlock accident, an incident that should have killed him, but left him with horrific scars across his body, William begins to physically deteriorate. He loses weight dramatically. His clothes, once fitted to his heavy-set frame, begin to hang on him, giving him a scarecrow-like appearance. His skin becomes sallow and unhealthy looking. His face becomes gaunt, the bones visible beneath thinning flesh. By the time we encounter him in the Fourth Closet, he's described as painfully thin, with one normal eye and one empty socket with a steel rod through it, with sections of his skin replaced by plastic and metal, with scars and surgical marks across his visible flesh. He smells of disinfectant and decay. The physical monster emerging from within mirrors the psychological monster that was always there. This physical decay is more than just the result of his Springlock injuries. It represents the manifestation of his internal state, the way his obsessive quest for immortality and his disregard for his own humanity are literally consuming him. He performs surgeries on himself, removes his own organs, replaces parts of his body with machine components, all in pursuit of surviving long enough to unlock the secrets of Remnant and achieve eternal life. The pain he must be in, the constant agony of existing in a body that's more machine than man, held together by wire and stitching and stubborn refusal to die, is hinted at, but never seems to register to him as something worth avoiding. Pain is just another obstacle to overcome, another inconvenience on the path to his ultimate goal. But it's the psychological portrait painted by the novels that gives us our deepest insights into what kind of person William Afton is. The books reveal that he kept journals, multiple stacks of them, filled with writings about Henry Emily. This obsessive documentation of another person goes far beyond normal professional rivalry, or even typical jealousy. It suggests a fixation that borders on parasocial obsession, where William's sense of self seems tangled up with his perception of Henry. He doesn't just want to be as good as Henry at engineering and animatronic design. He wants what Henry has. He wants Henry's creative spark, his genius for bringing inanimate objects to life in ways that go beyond mere mechanical function. He resents that Henry found something unique, something special, something William feels he neither deserved nor intended to discover. This resentment extends to Henry's personal life as well. Henry has a stable family, a wife and children he loves. He has the ability to form genuine emotional connections, something William seems fundamentally incapable of despite having his own family. The novels suggest that William's marriage was unhappy, that his wife and children were more burdens than blessings, objects that required his attention and resources without providing anything he valued in return. He's physically abusive to his daughter Elizabeth, shown hitting her for interrupting his work. He's neglectful of all his children, prioritizing his experiments and business over their basic emotional and physical needs. The contrast with Henry, who adores his daughter Charlotte and creates the security puppet specifically to keep her safe, couldn't be more stark. There's a fascinating complexity in novel William's relationship with Henry that reveals crucial aspects of his psychology. On one hand, he's consumed with jealousy and resentment toward Henry. He wants Henry to suffer, wants to take away what makes Henry happy, wants to prove himself superior. But simultaneously, there's an element of admiration, almost worship, in his obsessive documentation of everything Henry does. He borrows heavily from Henry's ideas, admits that he's learned most of what he knows from Henry, yet resents Henry for being the source of that knowledge. It's the psychology of someone who simultaneously admires and despises the object of their fixation, who can't separate their own identity from their perception of the other person, who measures their own worth entirely in comparison to someone else. This dynamic helps us understand one of William's most significant crimes in both the novels and the games, the murder of Charlotte Emily, Henry's daughter. In the novels, William kidnaps her twin brother Sammy instead, but the fundamental act remains the same, striking at Henry through his child, taking away what Henry loves most. This isn't a crime of passion or opportunity alone. It's calculated cruelty specifically designed to hurt someone who had what William lacked, the capacity for love and connection. By killing Charlotte in the games, or kidnapping Sammy in the novels, William isn't just committing murder. He's destroying Henry's happiness, pulling Henry down into the same void of loss and grief that seems to be William's natural state of existence. The novels also reveal William's scientific mindset, the way he approaches everything, including murder, as an experiment to be documented and analyzed. When one of his attempts fails, when someone he expected to die survives, his response isn't anger or frustration, but clinical disappointment. He says things like, "That's unfortunate, I hope to learn something." He views his victims not as people, but as test subjects, their deaths as data points in his ongoing research into remnant and possession. He's trying to replicate the accidents that led to possession, creating controlled conditions to achieve the same results. This requires a complete absence of empathy, an inability to see the children he's murdering as anything other than necessary components in his experiments. Novel William is also shown to be highly intelligent and manipulative. He's good with words, able to talk his way out of suspicion, to charm people into trusting him. He understands psychology well enough to exploit it, recognizing vulnerabilities in others and leveraging them for his purposes. When he dons the Spring Bonnie suit to lure children, he knows exactly what will make them follow him, what promises will gain their trust, what persona will make them feel safe. This manipulation extends to adults as well. He maintains a facade of respectability and success for years, even as he's committing atrocities, because he understands how to play the role people expect to see. But beneath the intelligence and manipulation, the novels show us something crucial. William Afton is fundamentally empty. There's a void where normal human emotions and connections should exist. He can't love, not in any meaningful way. He can't form real friendships, even with Henry, despite their years of partnership. He can't experience genuine joy or satisfaction from normal human experiences. Everything is transactional. Everything is about control and dominance and achieving his goals. When he talks about wanting to love, about recognizing that both he and Henry wanted this capacity, it's clear he's describing something he observes in others, rather than something he's actually experienced. He wants to love the way a blind person might want to see, as an abstract concept of something other people have that he lacks. This emptiness is perhaps the most crucial insight the novels give us into William Afton's psychology. It suggests that whatever happened in his childhood, whether trauma or inborn deficiency, it left him without the fundamental capacity for human connection. Psychologists would likely diagnose him as having antisocial personality disorder, commonly known as sociopathy or psychopathy. The characteristics fit remarkably well: superficial charm and above-average intelligence, absence of delusions or anxiety, unreliability and dishonesty, lack of remorse or shame, inadequately motivated antisocial behavior, poor judgment and failure to learn from experience, pathological egocentricity and incapacity for love, general poverty of major affective reactions, specific loss of insight, unresponsiveness in general interpersonal relations. The checklist reads like a description of William Afton across all his incarnations. The question the novels raise but can't answer is whether William was born this way or made this way. Did something happen to him as a child that destroyed his capacity for empathy? Was he abused or neglected in ways that prevented normal psychological development? Or was he simply born without something essential, a genetic anomaly that left him without the neural wiring for emotional connection? The novels don't tell us, just as the games don't tell us, and this absence of information is itself significant. It suggests that understanding the origin of his monstrosity isn't the point. The monster exists. The damage he's caused is real. The suffering he's inflicted is undeniable. Whether he had a tragic backstory that might explain his actions is ultimately irrelevant to his victims, to Henry, to anyone who's been touched by his evil. What the novels do definitively show us is the trajectory of someone who starts with this fundamental deficiency and then builds a life around it. William Afton doesn't start as Springtrap. He starts as a businessman, an engineer, a partner and father, someone who seems normal on the surface. But the emptiness inside him, the inability to connect with others in meaningful ways, creates a void that needs to be filled with something. For William, that something becomes obsession and control. He obsesses over Henry, over Remnant, over the animatronics and the secrets of possession. He seeks control over life and death itself, trying to master forces that shouldn't be in human hands. And through this obsession and need for control, he becomes progressively more monstrous, until the external horror of Springtrap matches the internal horror that was always there. The novels suggest that if we could somehow go back and meet young William Afton, before Fazbear Entertainment, before his partnership with Henry, we might meet someone who seemed relatively normal. Perhaps a bit odd, perhaps lacking the warmth that comes naturally to most people, perhaps showing early signs of callousness or cruelty, but not necessarily an obvious monster. The monster developed over time, cultivated by circumstances and choices, fed by jealousy and resentment, enabled by intelligence and opportunity. But the seed was always there. That fundamental absence of empathy, that void where human connection should exist. Everything else, all the murder and torture and experimentation, grew from that poisoned ground. The British connection, identity and origin. One of the most distinctive characteristics of William Afton in the modern era of Five Nights at Freddy's is his British accent. First heard when P.J. Haywood voiced the character in Sister Location. This accent has become so associated with Afton that it's now considered a definitive trait, appearing in Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, Ultimate Custom Night, and even influencing casting choices for the film adaptation. But the story of how William Afton became British is itself fascinating and reveals something about both the character and how our perceptions of villainy are shaped by cultural associations and voice acting choices. P.J. Haywood, the voice actor behind William Afton, and his son Michael, has been remarkably open about his creative choices in bringing these characters to life. In interviews, particularly his conversation with Dorco on the FNAF show, Haywood revealed that the British accent was not requested by Scott Cawthon. It wasn't in the original character description or voice direction. Instead, it was purely an acting choice Haywood made during his audition, and Scott liked it enough to keep it. More than that, Haywood has explained his reasoning behind this choice, stating that he believed Americans tend to associate British accents with evilness. This isn't an arbitrary belief. There's a long tradition in American media of British actors playing villains, from Alan Rickman to Anthony Hopkins, and audiences have been conditioned to hear that accent and expect sophisticated, calculating malevolence. Haywood specifically modelled William Afton's voice on Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of Dr. Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs. This is an incredibly revealing choice. Hannibal Lecter is perhaps the most famous fictional serial killer in cinema history, a character who combines brilliant intelligence with complete moral depravity, who can discuss art and philosophy with genuine sophistication, while calmly describing how he ate someone's liver with fava beans and a nice Chianti. Lecter is charming, cultured, and utterly terrifying precisely because his monstrosity hides behind such a civilized exterior. The accent, the measured way of speaking, the articulate vocabulary, all of it creates a persona of someone who exists above normal human concerns, who views other people as interesting specimens rather than fellow human beings. By basing William Afton's voice on this iconic portrayal, Haywood wasn't just giving him an accent. He was encoding an entire set of cultural associations and psychological implications into the character. When we hear Springtrap's raspy British voice in Special Delivery, or William's measured tones in Sister Location, we're meant to hear that same combination of intelligence and inhumanity that makes Hannibal Lecter so disturbing. We're meant to recognize someone who can speak eloquently about family and responsibility while simultaneously viewing his own children as tools or obstacles. The accent becomes a verbal mask, a layer of civilization draped over something fundamentally monstrous. What's particularly interesting is that Haywood himself is actually Australian, not British. His primary skill as a voice actor is faking a posh British accent, convincingly enough that most listeners assume he's actually British. This adds another layer to the performance. Just as William Afton wears the Spring Bonnie costume as a disguise, a cheerful yellow rabbit suit that hides the killer beneath, PJ Haywood is wearing a vocal disguise, an accent that isn't his own, but that serves to create the desired effect. The parallel is almost certainly unintentional, but thematically appropriate. Everything about William Afton is performance, facade, a carefully constructed exterior designed to hide his true nature. The British accent also raises questions about William Afton's origins within the game canon. If he has a British accent, does that mean he was born in Britain? Did he immigrate to America at some point before establishing Fazbear Entertainment? The games never address this, leaving it as one more mystery in a character already shrouded in unknowns. The novel trilogy doesn't make him British, though descriptions of his appearance could fit someone from various backgrounds. The fan community has run with the accent, incorporating it into fan works and theories, often imagining William as having come to America from Britain, perhaps in the 1960s or early 1970s, though there's no canonical basis for this timeline. Some theories suggest his surname, Afton, might indicate Swedish or Scottish ancestry rather than English, which adds another layer of complexity. Afton is a relatively uncommon surname that appears in both Swedish and Scottish records, though it's not frequent enough to strongly indicate either origin. If William's family was Swedish or Scottish, but he grew up in England before emigrating to America, that could explain the accent, while also accounting for the unusual surname. But again, this is pure speculation, the community trying to fill in blanks that Scott Cawthon deliberately left empty. What we can say more definitively is what the accent does for William Afton as a character, regardless of its in-universe explanation. It marks him as other, as someone who doesn't quite belong in the distinctly American setting of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, and the small town communities where these restaurants operate. It creates a sense of separation, of someone who stands apart from the local population, which makes his crimes feel even more like an outside contamination of an innocent community. The British accent, especially the posh, educated version Haywood performs, also immediately signals intelligence and sophistication. This isn't some crude, obvious monster. This is someone who could hold a conversation about robotics and engineering at a university level, who could charm investors and business partners, who could present himself as a respectable member of society. The accent also influences how we interpret William's relationship with Henry Emily. If we imagine Henry as American, as most interpretations do given the game's American setting, then the British William becomes the foreign element, the outside influence that corrupted Henry's innocent dream of creating entertainment for children. This dynamic plays into certain cultural narratives about corruption coming from outside, about foreign influence polluting domestic innocence, though whether Scott intended any of these implications is unclear. More likely, the accent simply worked as a character choice without deeper symbolic meaning, but the effect on audience perception is real regardless of intent. For the children William lured to their deaths, the accent would have made him seem exotic, interesting, different from the adults they knew in their everyday lives. Children are often drawn to people who seem special or unique in some way, and someone who speaks differently, who has this air of sophistication and foreignness, might have been easier for them to trust precisely because he didn't seem like the familiar authority figures they'd been taught to be wary of. The Spring Bonnie costume combined with this charming, sophisticated voice would have been a potent combination for winning children's trust, making them feel like they were being chosen for something special by someone special. The film adaptation, while taking its own approach to the character and lore, maintains the British accent tradition by casting Matthew Lillard, who affects a subtle British inflection in his performance as William Afton. This suggests that even in a different continuity with different creative teams, the British accent has become so intrinsic to William Afton's character that removing it would feel wrong. It's become part of his identity as a villain in the same way that the purple Sprite colour and the Spring Bonnie costume have. These elements combine to create a complete picture of who William Afton is, and changing any one of them would make the character feel incomplete. Ultimately, the British accent serves several purposes in defining William Afton as a character. It marks him as intelligent and sophisticated, playing into cultural associations between British accents and education. It creates a sense of otherness, of someone who doesn't quite belong in the American small-town setting. It connects him to a tradition of British accented villains in American media, tapping into expectations and archetypes audiences already understand. It provides a vocal mask, a layer of civilization and charm that makes his monstrosity more disturbing when revealed, and it distinguishes him from other characters, making his voice immediately recognizable even when we're hearing it through a degraded audio system or distorted by animatronic vocal cords. Whether William Afton was born in Britain, grew up there and emigrated to America, or somehow has a British accent despite being American-born, we'll likely never know from canon sources. But the accent itself has become canon, a defining trait that tells us something important about who this character is meant to be. He's not a local gone bad. He's an interloper, someone who came from elsewhere and brought his particular brand of horror with him. He's educated and cultured enough to speak in this refined way, which makes his crimes even more disturbing, because they're not the product of ignorance or limited capacity, but of deliberate choice by someone intelligent enough to know exactly what he's doing. The accent isn't just an accent. It's a window into the psychology of a monster who hides behind civilization while embodying its opposite. Henry Emily, the mirror and the catalyst. To understand William Afton, we must understand Henry Emily. More than just his business partner and co-founder of Fazbear Entertainment, Henry represents everything William isn't, everything William wants but can't have, and ultimately becomes the foil against which we can measure just how broken William truly is. Their relationship, suggested in the games and explored more fully in the novels, is the foundation upon which much of Five Nights at Freddy's tragedy is built. And examining this relationship gives us crucial insights into what drives William Afton, what motivates his crimes, and what emptiness inside him seeks to be filled by destroying what others have. Henry Emily is, by by all accounts a genius. Not in the sense that William is intelligent and skilled at engineering, but genius in the truest sense, the kind of creative spark that leads to genuine innovation rather than mere technical competence. He's the one who invents the spring lock mechanism, that clever but dangerous design that allows animatronic suits to be worn by performers. He's the one who creates the security puppet, programming it with the specific purpose of protecting his daughter Charlotte. He's the one whose animatronics have that special something, that sense of being almost alive, that William's creations, for all their sophistication, never quite achieve. Henry has a vision where William has ambition, creativity where William has cunning, and perhaps most significantly, heart where William has nothing but void. In the novel trilogy, Henry is described as withdrawn and shadowy, someone more comfortable with his machines than with people. This contrasts with William's presentation as robust and jovial, the glad-handing businessman who charms investors and customers. But this initial impression reverses when we look deeper. Henry's withdrawn nature stems from genuine human feeling, from the kind of sensitivity that makes dealing with people exhausting, but also allows for deep emotional connections with those he loves. William's joviality is performance, a mask he wears because he studied what people respond to and can mimic it convincingly. Henry is quiet because he feels too much. William is loud because he feels nothing. The novel version of William keeps journals about Henry, stacks and stacks of them, documenting everything about his partner. This goes far beyond normal professional interest, or even the kind of competitive awareness you might expect between business partners. It's obsessive, bordering on stalking behavior, the psychology of someone who's fixated on another person to an unhealthy degree. And what drives this obsession isn't admiration, not really, though there's an element of that present. It's jealousy, poisonous, consuming jealousy of someone who has what William lacks. Henry has a family he loves, a wife, and in most continuities, a daughter named Charlotte. And depending on the version, perhaps a son as well. He dotes on his children in a way that's genuine and heartfelt. He creates things for them, like the Fredbear plush that becomes so significant in FNAF 4, the security puppet designed to keep Charlotte safe, the careful attention to making his restaurant a place where children can truly be happy. His love for his family isn't performance, it's real. And this reality, this capacity for genuine love and connection, is something William can observe, can study, can document in his journals, but can never truly understand or replicate. William has a family too, a wife whose name and fate remain mysterious across most continuities, and 3 children, Michael, Elizabeth, and the younger son, often called the crying child. But his relationship with his family is fundamentally different from Henry's. William's family seems to be something that happened to him, rather than something he chose and nurtured. His children are burdens, obstacles, things that demand his attention and resources without providing anything he values in return. He's neglectful at best, as shown by his absence during the crying child's torment and ultimate death, and outright abusive at worst, as suggested by various sources including the novel's depiction of him hitting Elizabeth and the game's implication of his willingness to send Michael on what he knows is a suicide mission into the sister location facility. The contrast couldn't be more stark. Henry creates the security puppet specifically to keep Charlotte safe, programming it with the sole purpose of protecting his daughter. William creates the fun-time animatronics with hidden compartments specifically designed to kidnap and kill children, and his own daughter Elizabeth becomes one of their victims. Henry is devastated when Charlotte dies, driven to the brink of suicide by grief. ultimately taking years to plan his revenge against William, while trying to free the souls trapped by William's crimes. William shows no discernible grief when Elizabeth dies, only clinical interest in the fact that she's now possessed Circa's baby, making her useful for his remnant experiments. For Henry, his daughter's death is the worst thing that could possibly happen. For William, his daughter's death is interesting data. This fundamental difference in how they relate to their children reflects a deeper difference in their psychology. Henry has empathy, the capacity to put himself in another's place, to feel their pain and joy as if it were his own. This makes him vulnerable, makes him capable of being hurt, but it also makes him human in the fullest sense. William lacks this capacity entirely. He can intellectually understand that other people have feelings, can even manipulate those feelings effectively, but he doesn't experience them himself, doesn't feel that fundamental connection to other humans that makes their suffering matter. In the games, Henry's final confrontation with William in Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator provides the most insight into their relationship we get from that continuity. Henry's speech, delivered as the restaurant burns around them, is addressed partly to the souls he's trying to free, but also clearly directed at William, his old friend and partner, who betrayed everything they built together. He talks about how he was naive, how he remained naive for so long about what William had done. This suggests that Henry wanted to believe in William, wanted to think his partner was a good person, perhaps even after evidence suggested otherwise. Henry's capacity for trust and connection made him blind to the monster operating next to him for years. Henry calls the fire a gift, a way to release the souls William trapped and finally end the nightmare. But he also stays to burn with them, refusing to escape, choosing to share the fate he's imposed on William and the animatronics. This choice speaks to Henry's sense of responsibility. He blames himself for William's crimes, for being naive enough not to see what was happening, for building the technology and the restaurants that William then weaponized. Henry's suicide by fire is his atonement, his way of taking responsibility for the role he played, however unwitting, in allowing William's evil to flourish. But there's another element to Henry's relationship with William that the fandom has picked up on and explored extensively, particularly in fan works and theories. There's a strange intimacy to their partnership, a closeness that goes beyond normal business relationships. Henry's grief over William's betrayal isn't just about the crimes themselves, but about the personal betrayal of someone he trusted completely, someone he considered his closest friend. The novel trilogy makes William's obsession with Henry textually explicit through the journals, but even in the games, there's a sense that their connection was deeper and more complex than simple professional collaboration. Some interpretations suggest romantic or quasi-romantic feelings on William's part, an obsession that contains elements of attraction twisted by his incapacity for genuine love. The idea that William might have been in love with Henry, or at least his version of what love might mean to someone fundamentally broken, adds another layer to his crimes. By killing Charlotte, William destroys Henry's happiness and forces Henry to understand loss and grief in a way he perhaps hadn't before. It's a deeply personal violation, an attack on the one person William had the closest thing to a connection with. And that attack is launched at Henry's child, the embodiment of Henry's capacity for love that William can never truly share. Whether this romantic interpretation is canon is debatable and probably unknowable. But what is clear is that Henry represents something William desperately wants but can never have. Not just his creative genius, though William certainly resents that. Not just his happy family, though that envy is real, but the capacity itself, the ability to feel and connect and love, the thing that makes Henry human in ways William simply isn't. William can see the happiness his capacity brings Henry, can document how Henry lights up around his daughter, how he pours his heart into his work, and William wants that feeling for himself. But it's not something that can be taken or learned or stolen. It's something you either have or you don't, and William doesn't. This realization, this understanding that there's something fundamental missing from him that he observes in Henry and others, might be the closest William Afton comes to genuine suffering. Not physical pain, which he endures seemingly without complaint, even when his body is falling apart, but the existential pain of recognizing your own emptiness, of seeing people experience something you never can, of being permanently separated from a fundamental aspect of human experience by the void inside you. Some interpretations suggest this realization is what drives him toward immortality. The idea that if he can't truly live in the way Henry does, at least he can refuse to die, can persist and continue, and never have to face the ultimate end. Henry's role in the narrative is ultimately redemptive. He recognizes too late what William has done and what he himself unwittingly enabled. He takes responsibility for his naivety and his failures to protect the children who died. He crafts a plan that will free the souls and destroy William, even knowing it will cost his own life. He makes the hard choice to end it all because allowing it to continue is worse. Henry Emily is, in many ways, the moral center of Five Nights at Freddy's, the character who represents conscience and responsibility and the willingness to sacrifice yourself to stop evil. William Afton is Henry's opposite in every way that matters. Where Henry creates to bring joy, William creates to control and harm. Where Henry takes responsibility for his failures, William shows no remorse for his deliberate crimes. Where Henry chooses death to end the suffering, William clings to existence at any cost, refusing to accept his own mortality. Where Henry loves, William only obsesses. Where Henry grieves, William merely observes. The tragedy of their relationship is that Henry saw William as a friend, as someone worthy of trust and partnership, while William saw Henry as an object of obsession, someone to be studied and envied, and ultimately punished for having what William could never possess. Understanding this dynamic, understanding how William Afton measures himself entirely against Henry Emily and finds himself lacking in ways he can't fix or change, gives us crucial insight into his psychology. His crimes aren't random acts of violence. They're calculated attempts to destroy what he can't have, to drag others down into the emptiness he inhabits, to make the world reflect the void inside himself. Charlotte's murder isn't just the killing of a child. It's the murder of Henry's happiness, the destruction of what made Henry special. The missing children aren't just victims of a serial killer. They're experiments in William's quest to achieve what Henry achieved naturally, the creation of something that transcends mere mechanics to become almost alive. If we trace William Afton's path from whoever he was before to the monster we know, Henry Emily is the constant presence, the measuring stick against which William judges himself and finds himself fundamentally deficient. Their partnership founded Fazbear Entertainment and created something that brought joy to countless children. But that same partnership created the circumstances that allowed William's evil to manifest and multiply. Henry's genius provided the tools, William's malevolence provided the will, and the children of Utah paid the price. Psychology of a monster, understanding the killer. To understand what might have created William Afton, we need to understand what William Afton is. And what he is, at his core, is a serial killer who primarily targets children. This isn't a revelation to anyone familiar with Five Nights at Freddy's lore, but it's worth stating explicitly because it allows us to compare William to real-world serial killers and understand the psychological patterns that typically characterize such individuals. Scott Cawthon has confirmed that several infamous real-life criminals served as inspiration for William Afton's character, including John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Edmund Kemper, and Robert Berchtold. By examining these inspirations and understanding the psychology of serial killers more broadly, we can begin to build a profile of the kind of person William Afton is, and by extension, theorize about what kind of childhood might produce such a person. John Wayne Gacy, known as the Killer Clown, murdered at least 33 young men and boys between 1972 and 1978. He was a successful businessman, a community leader, someone who performed at children's parties as Pogo the Clown. He was, by all outward appearances, a respectable member of society. His neighbors spoke highly of him. He had a wife and children. He seemed normal, even admirable in his community involvement. But underneath this facade was a sadistic killer who tortured and murdered young men, burying most of them in the crawl space under his house. The parallel to William Afton is obvious. Both are successful businessmen. Both are involved in entertainment for children. Both wear costumes that allow them to gain children's trust. Both present a facade of normalcy, while committing atrocities hidden from public view. Gacy's childhood provides insight into how such a monster might develop. His father was an abusive alcoholic who beat him and his siblings regularly, who called him stupid and worthless, who created an environment of fear and humiliation. Gacy struggled with his sexuality in an era and environment where being gay was considered shameful and disgusting, leading to intense self-loathing and confusion. He suffered a head injury as a child that caused a blood clot in his brain, which some have theorized might have contributed to his later behavior. But many people experience abuse, confusion about sexuality, and head injuries without becoming serial killers. The factors that create a monster are always more complex than simple cause and effect. Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991, and his crimes included necrophilia, dismemberment, and cannibalism. Unlike Gacy, Dahmer was more open about his profound sense of isolation and emptiness. He described feeling different from other people from a very young age, unable to connect with them in normal ways, drawn to fantasies of control and dominance over others. His childhood, by most accounts, was relatively normal on the surface. His parents had a troubled marriage and eventually divorced, but he wasn't subjected to the kind of extreme abuse that marked Gacy's upbringing. Yet something was wrong with Jeffrey Dahmer from an early age, a fascination with death and dead things that manifested in his childhood interest in dissecting roadkill and collecting animal bones. This pattern in Dahmer's early life, the seemingly normal exterior hiding something fundamentally wrong beneath, parallels what we might imagine about young William Afton. Perhaps he too seemed relatively normal as a child. Perhaps there were no obvious signs that he would become a murderer, just subtle indicators that something wasn't quite right. The cruelty to animals, the fascination with taking things apart to see how they work, the inability to form normal friendships, the sense of being separate from and superior to other children. These warning signs might have been present, but easy to dismiss or overlook. especially in an era before we understood childhood psychology and behavior as well as we do now. Edmund Kemper murdered 10 people, including his grandparents as a teenager and later his mother and several young women. He's notable for his extremely high IQ, often cited as being around 145, and his ability to articulate his own psychology with disturbing clarity. Kemper has described his childhood as dominated by a cruel and emotionally abusive mother, who locked him in the basement as punishment, who berated him constantly, who made him feel worthless and broken. He tortured and killed the family cats as a child, an early indicator of his violent tendencies. When he murdered his grandparents at age 15, it wasn't impulsive rage but something he described as wanting to see what it would feel like to kill someone. This combination of high intelligence, childhood abuse, early warning signs and calculated violence makes Kemper a particularly relevant comparison to William Afton. Robert Berchtold is different from the other three inspirations because he's not primarily known as a murderer, but as a child predator who groomed and abused children over many years. His ability to charm and manipulate families, to gain their trust so completely that they allowed him near their children, to create situations where he could isolate and victimize kids without anyone suspecting, makes him perhaps the most relevant inspiration for understanding how William Afton operated. Berchtold understood child psychology, knew how to make children feel special and chosen, how to convince them that what he was doing was normal or even good for them. William Afton, luring children with the promise of seeing their dead pet or receiving a special prize, demonstrates this same calculated manipulation of children's trust and emotional vulnerabilities. What all of these real-world killers share, and what they share with William Afton, is a fundamental disconnect from normal human empathy and emotion. Psychologists studying serial killers have identified several consistent characteristics. Most have what's called a grandiose sense of self-worth, believing themselves to be superior to other people, more intelligent, more important, deserving of special treatment. They're often skilled at mimicking emotion and creating facades of normalcy, because they've learned that displaying certain behaviors gets certain responses, but the feelings behind those behaviors aren't real. They view other people instrumentally, as objects to be used rather than as fellow humans with intrinsic value. They show no genuine remorse for their actions because they lack the capacity for feeling remorse, though they may express it if they think it will be advantageous to do so. This psychological profile fits William Afton perfectly. His intelligence is undeniable, both in his engineering skills and his ability to manipulate and evade suspicion for years. His sense of superiority is evident in everything he does, from his condescending interactions with others to his absolute confidence that he can achieve what he's attempting, even when that involves conquering death itself. His emotional mimicry is shown in how he can present as a jovial businessman or concerned father while feeling nothing genuine behind the mask. His instrumental view of other people is demonstrated by how he uses his own children, his business partner, and countless victims as tools to achieve his goals, with no consideration for their humanity or suffering. The question of whether serial killers are born or made remains debated in psychology and criminology. Some research suggests genetic factors, potential abnormalities in brain structure or function that predispose someone toward violence and lack of empathy. Studies have found differences in the brains of psychopaths, particularly in areas related to emotional processing and impulse control. If William Afton has these neurological differences, they would be something he was born with, a part of his fundamental nature rather than something created by experience. But environment clearly plays a role as well. Even if someone has genetic predisposition towards psychopathy, whether they become a serial killer depends heavily on their life experiences, opportunities, and choices. Many people with psychopathic traits channel them into socially acceptable outlets, becoming successful in business or politics, where ruthlessness and lack of empathy can actually be advantages. What determines whether someone with these traits becomes a CEO or a serial killer involves complex interactions between their nature and their environment. If we try to imagine William Afton's childhood, we have to account for both possibilities. Maybe he was born lacking empathy, with brain structures that made normal emotional connection impossible. But even if that's true, his environment would have shaped how this deficiency manifested. A child who lacks empathy but grows up in a loving, structured environment with strong moral guidance might learn to at least follow societal rules for pragmatic reasons. A child with the same neurological profile who grows up neglected, abused, or without proper boundaries might have no reason to restrain their impulses beyond what they can get away with. Some fan theories suggest William came from an abusive background, perhaps with an alcoholic father like Gacy's, or a cruel mother like Kemper's. The idea that William was himself a victim before becoming a victimizer has appeal because it provides a neat causal chain, a way to understand how someone becomes this way. But it's worth noting that many serial killers had relatively normal childhoods, or at least not obviously traumatic ones. Dahmer's childhood was dysfunctional, but not extraordinarily abusive. Some killers come from loving families and still become monsters. The relationship between childhood trauma and adult violence is real, but not deterministic. What we can say with more confidence is that William Afton likely showed early warning signs of his later behavior. The so-called McDonald triad, enuresis, bedwetting past age 5, pyromania, fire setting, and cruelty to animals, has been suggested as predictive of serial killer behavior, though more recent research questions how reliable these markers really are. Still, many serial killers did display one or more of these behaviors in childhood. William Afton, with his later fascination with mechanical bodies and his apparent lack of revulsion at harming or killing living things, might well have tortured or killed animals as a child. This wouldn't necessarily be sadistic pleasure, but clinical curiosity, wanting to see what would happen, how things worked. The same cold scientific interest he would later bring to human victims. He likely had difficulty forming normal childhood relationships. Other kids would sense something off about him, some absence of normal emotional reciprocity that makes friendship feel unrewarding. He might have been isolated and bullied, or he might have been able to perform sociability well enough to have surface-level friendships without true connection. Either way, there would have been a fundamental loneliness, not the kind that comes from wanting connection and not having it, but the kind that comes from being unable to want connection in the way other people do, of observing it in others as an interesting phenomenon without understanding it from the inside. His intelligence would have been evident early. Bright children often struggle socially because they're not interested in the same things as their age peers. And if William was already intellectually ahead, already fascinated by how things work and how systems can be created and controlled, he might have been dismissed as a weird but smart kid. Someone who would probably grow up to be successful even if he was odd. Teachers might have encouraged his interests in engineering and mechanics without recognizing the absence of human warmth underlying his technical fascination. The family dynamics are pure speculation, but if we had to construct a childhood that might produce William Afton, it might look something like this. Parents who were either emotionally unavailable or actively abusive, who didn't provide the kind of early attachment that allows children to develop empathy and emotional connection. A father who was demanding and critical, measuring worth purely by achievement, making young William feel he had to constantly prove his value through what he could do, rather than who he was. A mother who was absent or neglectful, unable or unwilling to provide emotional nurturing, leaving William without the early bonding experiences that shape our capacity for love. Perhaps siblings who got more attention or affection, creating jealousy and resentment that would later manifest in his relationship with Henry Emily. But it's entirely possible none of this happened. William might have had perfectly adequate parents who did everything right. The absence of empathy might have been there from birth, a genetic roll of the dice that created someone who could learn to mimic human emotion, but never truly feel it. The monster might have been inevitable regardless of circumstance, nature overwhelming any influence of nurture. What we can say is that by the time William Afton appears in the law as an adult, he displays the full range of psychopathic traits. His crimes aren't impulsive or emotional. They're calculated and purposeful, serving his larger goals of understanding remnant and achieving immortality. He feels no remorse because he lacks the capacity for it. He views his victims instrumentally, as necessary components in his experiments. He's charming and manipulative when it serves him, cold and cruel when that's more useful. He's intelligent enough to understand how normal people think and feel, allowing him to manipulate them, but he doesn't experience those thoughts and feelings himself. Understanding this psychology helps us recognize why William Afton is such an effective horror villain. He's not a monster in the sense of being inhuman or supernatural, though he eventually becomes that through his own actions. He's a monster in the sense of being a human with something crucial missing. Someone who walks through the world that contains all the complexity and intelligence of a person, but none of the heart. And that absence, that void where empathy and connection should be, makes him capable of horrors that most people literally can't imagine committing, because the barriers of empathy that stop us from harming others simply don't exist for him. Whether this absence was something William was born with, or something created by his childhood, or more likely some combination of both, is ultimately unknowable from the law we have. But the result is clear. By the time he enters into partnership with Henry Emily, by the time he starts building animatronics and establishing restaurants, William Afton is already a fully formed psychopath, someone whose brilliant mind and complete lack of conscience make him one of the most dangerous people in the Five Nights at Freddy's universe. The seeds of every horror that follows, every child murdered, every soul trapped, every life destroyed, exist in that fundamental emptiness at William Afton's core. The immortality quest. When did it begin? One of the defining characteristics of William Afton across all continuities is his obsessive quest for immortality. This isn't mere fear of death in the abstract way most humans experience it. This is a consuming need to overcome mortality, to persist beyond the natural end of life, to achieve eternal existence through whatever means necessary. Understanding when and why this obsession began is crucial to understanding William Afton's development from serial killer to the nightmare entity he eventually becomes. And while we can't pinpoint an exact moment when immortality became his driving goal, we can trace the likely evolution of his thinking and theorize about what might have sparked this particular fixation. The Five Nights at Freddy's community generally agrees that Charlotte Emily's murder and subsequent possession of the security puppet was the catalyst that turned William's attention toward the possibility of life after death. Before Charlotte, William was likely already a murderer, someone whose lack of empathy and view of children as objects made killing them relatively easy when opportunity arose. But Charlotte's murder had an unexpected consequence that William almost certainly observed. Her spirit didn't simply vanish. It remained, binding itself to the puppet animatronic Henry had created to protect her. And William, with his scientific mind and his fascination with mechanics and innovation, would have been intensely interested in this phenomenon. Imagine being William Afton in this moment. You've killed your business partner's daughter, whether out of jealousy of Henry's happy family, opportunistic cruelty, or some combination thereof. You expect this murder to be like any others you might have committed, an act that destroys the victim and traumatizes the survivors, but follows natural laws. Death is final. The person is gone. What remains is just a body that will be discovered and eventually decay to nothing. But instead, something impossible happens. The child's consciousness persists. It inhabits the animatronic. It demonstrates awareness, agency, the ability to interact with the physical world despite being by all biological definitions dead. For most people, this would be terrifying, perhaps guilt-inducing, a horror that demonstrates the permanence and wrongness of what they've done. But William Afton isn't most people. His response to discovering that consciousness can persist in animatronics would be scientific curiosity. This is revolutionary information. This changes everything. If souls can bind to machines, if consciousness can persist beyond death through some mechanism he doesn't yet understand, then death itself might not be inevitable. The natural end that comes for all living things might be circumvented, overcome, defeated. And William, with his grandiose sense of his own importance, his intelligence, his accomplishments, would immediately want to understand how this works and how he can use it. This is where his quest for remnant begins, though the term and the specifics come later in the lore. Remnant, that mysterious substance that seems to be physical, yet also spiritual, that can hold the essence of a person and transfer it to an animatronic or other vessel, becomes William's obsession. In the novels, remnant is described as something created when someone dies in proximity to metal. The agony and emotion of death somehow infusing into the physical material. In the games, the concept is less explicitly defined but clearly present, with William melting down possessed animatronics to extract something that he can then use in his experiments. The fun-time animatronics are injected with remnant, given fragments of the murdered children's souls, making them animated by something more than mere programming. But when did this obsession truly take hold? Was it immediately after Charlotte's death, the moment William realized what had happened? Or did it develop more gradually? After the missing children incident in 1985, when William murdered 5 more children, and the puppet helped their spirits possess Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and Golden Freddy. Perhaps William conducted these murders specifically to test whether the phenomenon was repeatable, whether he could deliberately create possessed animatronics by killing children in or near them, whether the conditions that led to Charlotte's possession could be replicated under controlled circumstances. This would explain the methodical nature of the 1985 murders. William lures the children systematically, murders them, stuffs their bodies into the suits. He's not just killing. He's conducting an experiment. He's testing a hypothesis about possession and consciousness transfer. And when the experiment succeeds, when the 5 children's spirits do indeed possess the animatronics, just as Charlotte possessed the puppet, William has his confirmation. This isn't a unique occurrence. It's a reproducible phenomenon. And if it's reproducible, it can be studied, understood, refined, and ultimately weaponized for his own purposes. The Funtime animatronics represent William's next level of experimentation. These aren't just animatronics that happen to become possessed through murder in their vicinity. These are machines specifically designed with possession in mind, with chambers that can hold remnant, with programming that incorporates the captured soul fragments, with capabilities that go beyond what mere mechanics should allow. Circus Baby, Ballora, Funtime Freddy, Funtime Foxy, all of them are built not just to entertain, but to kill and to contain. They're William's attempt to create possessed animatronics deliberately, rather than waiting for the right circumstances to arise. And Elizabeth's death, while perhaps accidental in the moment, serves William's purposes perfectly. His own daughter possesses Circus Baby, giving him a possessed animatronic containing someone he knew in life. This allows him to study the phenomenon more closely, to see how much of Elizabeth remains in Baby, how the human consciousness interacts with and is modified by the artificial intelligence and mechanical body it inhabits. The novel trilogy shows William as utterly cold toward Elizabeth's death, viewing it as interesting data rather than personal tragedy. Whatever capacity for fatherly love he might have possessed, if he ever had any at all, is subordinated to his scientific interest in what his daughter's possession means for his quest. But there's another layer to William's immortality quest that goes deeper than just scientific curiosity. In both the games and the novels, there are suggestions that William fears death on a profound, perhaps even pathological level. The novel version explicitly talks about this, showing William in his deteriorating state terrified of running out of time, desperate to complete his work before his failing body gives out. He talks about preferring to exist in his current agonizing state rather than face the final end. This isn't just a preference for life over death. This is existential terror of non-existence. This fear might have roots in whatever childhood William had. If he lacked the capacity for normal emotional connection, if he felt empty and separate from others his entire life, death would represent the final confirmation of his isolation. Most people find comfort in ideas of afterlife, or at least in the legacy they leave through the people who loved them and the connections they made. William has none of that. He can't love and hasn't been loved, not genuinely. His legacy is one of horror and pain. If death means simply ceasing to exist, then his entire existence, all his intelligence and accomplishments and innovations, amounts to nothing. The void he's felt inside him his whole life would become literal, permanent, total. This fear would make his discovery of possession even more significant. Here is empirical evidence that consciousness continues after death. The children he murdered didn't simply cease to exist. They persist in some form, aware and capable of action. If they can do it, if this is possible, then perhaps he can too. Perhaps he can find a way to ensure his consciousness persists, that the void doesn't win, that he doesn't have to face that final darkness. This would elevate his experiments from clinical interest to desperate need, from wanting to understand the phenomenon to needing to master it for his own survival. The losses of his own children, both the crying child who dies from the bite of 83 and Elizabeth, who dies from baby's capture mechanism, might serve as additional motivations. Not because William genuinely grieves them in the way a normal parent would, but because their deaths remind him of his own mortality. If his children can die, if these young, healthy beings can have their lives cut short so easily, then he too is vulnerable. The springlock failures that nearly kill him early in his career would reinforce this awareness of how fragile human life is, how close death always lurks. Each brush with mortality would feed his fear and intensify his drive to find a way to transcend the natural end. There's also the element of control in William's immortality quest. Everything in his life is about controlling things that most people accept as beyond control. He wants to control life and death, to command souls, to determine who persists and who doesn't. Achieving immortality would be the ultimate expression of this need for control. It would mean he's overcome the one thing that no human can control. The one universal truth that applies to everyone regardless of intelligence or achievement. It would prove his superiority, confirm his grandiose sense of himself as someone who exists above normal human limitations. By the time we encounter William in the later games, particularly in Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator and Security Breach, his quest for immortality has effectively succeeded in some form, though not in the way he intended. He survives the springlock failure that should have killed him, his corpse fusing with the Spring Bonnie suit to become Springtrap. He survives being burned in Fazbear's Fright. He survives again being burned in the Pizzeria Simulator fire. The help-wanted VR game introduces Glitchtrap, a digital entity that many interpret as William's consciousness uploaded from Remnant when old circuit boards are scanned, though the exact nature of this entity remains debated within the community, particularly with revelations about the Mimic in later games. He keeps coming back, keeps refusing to die, keeps persisting in new forms. "I always come back" becomes his catchphrase, because it's the truth. He's achieved a twisted form of immortality, existing in states that can't properly be called alive, but aren't truly death either. But this immortality is torment as much as triumph. William exists in constant agony, his body destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again, his consciousness fragmented and corrupted, his existence reduced to an endless cycle of pain and violence. The immortality he sought to avoid, the void, has trapped him in something worse, an eternal present without relief, without peace, without end. Whether this is justice or tragedy or both depends on perspective, but it's certainly a fitting conclusion to his quest. He wanted to live forever, and he got his wish, but forever turns out to be its own kind of hell. The question of when William's immortality quest began will probably never be definitively answered in canon, but we can trace its likely development from the moment he discovered that death wasn't necessarily final, through his experiments and murders designed to test and refine his understanding, to his increasingly desperate attempts to preserve his own consciousness as his body fails, to his ultimate fate of existing in various tormented forms far beyond the natural span of human life. What started as scientific curiosity fed by fear of death became an all-consuming obsession that defined the rest of his existence and created suffering on a massive scale. And at its root was that same emptiness that defines all of William Afton's actions. The void where normal human acceptance of mortality should be, replaced by a need to control and persist that will accept any cost, destroy any life, commit any atrocity in service of his own continuation. Family dysfunction, the Afton household. To understand what created William Afton, we need to examine not just his own possible childhood, but the childhood he created for his own children. the way someone's parents often reflects their own upbringing, and the Afton household, as revealed across the games and novels, is a masterclass in dysfunction, neglect, and the cascading trauma that occurs when someone fundamentally incapable of love tries to perform the role of father. By examining Michael, Elizabeth, and the crying child, we can work backward to theorize about what William himself might have experienced as a child, and we can see how the cycle of damage perpetuates across generations. The Afton family structure itself raises immediate questions. William has 3 children, presumably with the same mother, a woman referred to as Mrs. Afton, who remains one of the most mysterious characters in the entire franchise. She's never shown in the games, never heard, barely referenced. Some fans theorize she's the spirit possessing Ballora, based on Ballora's song lyrics about being left alone and ignored, fitting the experience of a woman married to William Afton. Other theories suggest she left the family or died young, which would explain her absence from the children's lives. The novels give her the name Eleanor Schmidt in the Bluey Capsules fan continuity, but no canon source provides definitive information about who she was or what happened to her. Her absence itself tells us something significant about the Afton household. Either she died, leaving William to raise 3 children alone, or she left, which would suggest the marriage was unhappy and perhaps abusive. Or she's still present, but so neglected in the narrative that she might as well not exist, which would reflect her lived experience in the family, present physically, but ignored emotionally. Any of these scenarios creates an environment where the children are being raised primarily by William, or possibly being raised by no one, left to navigate their childhood without adequate supervision or emotional support. Michael, the eldest Afton child, is perhaps the most developed character among the children, appearing or being referenced across multiple games. We first encounter him as the older brother in FNAF 4, the one wearing the foxy mask, leading his friends in tormenting the crying child. He and his friends chase the child, jump scare him, lock him in rooms, and ultimately force him into the spring-loaded jaws of the Fredbear animatronic in a cruel prank that goes catastrophically wrong. Michael's behavior is classic bullying, the older sibling tormenting the younger, but it goes beyond typical sibling rivalry into something genuinely cruel. Why does Michael behave this way? The easy answer is that he's a teenager, and teenagers can be thoughtlessly cruel, caught between childhood and adulthood, without fully understanding the consequences of their actions. But Michael's cruelty toward his brother seems to have an edge to it, a meanness that suggests it's not just teenage thoughtlessness, but learned behavior. Children who are themselves neglected or abused often take out their frustration on those more vulnerable than themselves. Michael, growing up in a household where his father is emotionally absent and possibly abusive, where his mother is absent or ineffectual, would have legitimate grievances and pain that he can't express to his parents. So he expresses it to his younger brother, the one person in the household more powerless than himself. Michael's torment of the crying child could also be an attempt to get his father's attention, even if that attention is negative. William is shown observing through the Fredbear plushie cameras, watching his younger son's fear and suffering without intervening. If Michael knows or suspects this surveillance exists, his cruelty toward his brother might be performative, an act designed to provoke some kind of reaction from their absent father. Look at me, see what I'm doing. Notice that I exist and respond in some way. Any attention, even punishment, would be preferable to being ignored. The aftermath of the bite of 83, which kills the crying child, clearly traumatizes Michael. His apology in FNAF 4's final scene, the crying and guilt, shows that he didn't intend for his brother to die, that he's capable of feeling remorse when confronted with the consequences of his actions. This capacity for guilt distinguishes Michael from his father, suggesting that whatever is broken in William wasn't passed down to his son, at least not to the same degree. Michael can feel, can recognize when he's done wrong, can experience genuine regret. These are capacities his father lacks entirely. But Michael's guilt doesn't free him from the cycle of damage. In Sister Location, we play as Michael sent by William to the underground facility where the Funtime animatronics are stored. William's instructions to Michael to find and free Elizabeth are either a suicide mission or a test, sending his son into mortal danger with full knowledge of what waits there. By the end of Sister Location, Michael is scooped, his insides removed and replaced by Enard, the amalgamation of the Funtime animatronics. He should die from this. His body literally rots, turning purple and decaying. But the remnant infused into Enard keeps Michael animated, creates an undead state where his consciousness persists in his decaying body. William sending Michael to his probable death tells us everything about their relationship. A normal father, even one who was cold or distant, wouldn't deliberately send his son to die. But William views Michael as expendable, as a tool he can use for his purposes. Whether William is testing Michael, punishing him for his brother's death, or simply needs someone to enter the facility and considers Michael's life less valuable than his own, the result is the same. Michael is not cherished or protected. He's used and discarded. Yet Michael, even after this ultimate betrayal, continues pursuing his father's work. The evidence strongly suggests Michael is the protagonist in Pizzeria Simulator as well, drawn into Henry's plan to end his father once and for all. Though this interpretation, while widely accepted, is based on contextual clues rather than explicit confirmation. In Security Breach's Unused Law and the novel trilogy, there are suggestions that Michael spent years hunting his father, trying to undo the damage William caused. Michael's entire adult life becomes defined by his father's crimes and his own attempts at redemption. The child who accidentally killed his brother in a cruel prank becomes the man trying to free the souls his father deliberately murdered. It's a narrative of breaking the cycle, of choosing to be better than your upbringing. But it's also profoundly sad. Michael never gets to just be himself. He's always Afton's son, always carrying that legacy, always trying to atone. Elizabeth Afton presents a different facet of dysfunction in the Afton household. Where Michael rebels and acts out, Elizabeth desperately seeks her father's approval. In Sister Location's private room dialogue, Circus Baby's voice, now containing Elizabeth's soul, talks about how William told her not to go near Baby, how he warned her specifically to stay away. But children don't easily follow instructions without explanation, especially when they see something colorful and entertaining that seems designed to delight them. Elizabeth went to Baby because she was curious, because she wanted to interact with her father's creation, and perhaps because defying his rules was a way to get his attention. The novel trilogy's depiction of Elizabeth is particularly damning in what it reveals about William's treatment of his daughter. He's shown hitting her for interrupting his work, physically abusing her for the crime of demanding his attention. This abuse, combined with neglect, creates a twisted dynamic where Elizabeth both fears and craves her father's presence. She's learned that she won't receive positive attention, but negative attention is better than being ignored. So she pushes boundaries, defies rules, takes risks, all in a desperate bid to be seen by a father who views her as an annoyance at best. When Elizabeth dies, killed by the very animatronic her father created and warned her away from, William's response is not grief, but clinical interest. His daughter has become useful. She's possessed Circus Baby, making her a test subject for his remnant experiments. The novel version of William shows no mourning, no regret, just fascination with what Elizabeth's death and possession mean for his research. This complete absence of parental love, this inability to grieve his own child, demonstrates how utterly broken William is emotionally. Elizabeth sought her father's attention her entire short life and only truly received it after her death, when she became useful to his experiments. Circus Baby, containing Elizabeth's soul, seems to retain some of her desperate need for approval. Her dialogue in Sister Location is manipulative, but also strangely childlike, wanting to please, wanting to follow instructions correctly, wanting to be valued. Elizabeth never escaped her father's influence even in death. She's trapped not just in the animatronic, but in the psychological patterns he created in her, still seeking validation from a father incapable of providing it. The crying child, the youngest Afton son, is perhaps the most tragic figure in the entire family. We never learn his name in the games, know him only through his tears and fear. He's terrified of everything in his world, the animatronics his father creates, the restaurant his family is connected to, his older brother's bullying, even the shadows in his own room at night. This pervasive fear suggests a child living in constant anxiety, never feeling safe, always waiting for the next threat. The crying child's fear of animatronics is particularly significant, given that his father is one of their primary creators. Most children whose parents run family entertainment venues feel pride and excitement about it. Their parents' work is something special, something that brings joy to other children. But the crying child only feels terror. This suggests he's seen something, understood something about the animatronics that other children haven't. Some hint of the darkness underneath their cheerful exterior. Perhaps he's witnessed his father's cruelty. Perhaps he's picked up on the wrongness of William's emotional absence. Perhaps he simply has a child's intuitive sense that something is very wrong in his family, and has projected that fear onto the animatronics as the most visible representation of that wrongness. William's response to his younger son's fear is surveillance rather than comfort. The Fredbear plushies scattered through FNAF 4 contain cameras and speakers, allowing William to watch and even speak to his son without being present. "I will put you back together," the plushie says, a promise that has never been adequately explained in canon. Is this William promising to bring his son back somehow if he dies? Is it Henry trying to comfort the child through William's surveillance equipment? The ambiguity is haunting, but what's clear is that William is monitoring his son's terror without intervening to actually help or protect him. A normal father, seeing his child this frightened, would provide comfort and protection. He would address the fears, explain that the animatronics are safe, perhaps keep them away from the home environment. He certainly wouldn't stand by while the child's older brother terrorizes him relentlessly. But William does nothing. He watches and records but doesn't act. The crying child is left to navigate his fear alone, without support, until that fear is validated in the worst possible way, when Fredbear's jaws crush his skull. The Bite of 83 happens at the crying child's birthday party, an event that should be celebratory, but instead becomes a nightmare. Michael and his friends carrying out their meanest prank yet, forcefully shoved the child's head into Fredbear's mouth. The spring locks, perhaps loosened by the crying child's tears, snap shut. The child is mortally wounded, lingers briefly in a coma with flowers and plushies by his hospital bed, and then dies, the flat line of his heart monitor marking the end of his short, frightened life. William's role in this tragedy is passive but damning. He was responsible for the child's safety. He was the one who created the spring-lock suits and knew their dangers. He was the one who could have intervened in Michael's bullying. He was the one who chose to surveil rather than parent. The crying child's death is not directly William's fault in the way Charlotte's murder is, but it's a death that occurs because of William's fundamental failure as a father. A child raised with love and attention, with a parent who protected him from bullying and ensured his safety around dangerous animatronics, would likely not have died this way. And what does William do with his son's death? The law suggests the crying child might possess Golden Freddy, or might be connected to Shadow Freddy, or might be the vengeful spirit that torments William in Ultimate Custom Night. Depending on which interpretation you follow, William either uses his son's death as another data point in his remnant research, or the child's spirit becomes one more piece of evidence that consciousness persists after death, furthering William's immortality quest. Either way, William doesn't grieve. He observes, documents, continues his experiments. His son's death matters only for what it reveals about possession and remnant, not for the loss of a child he should have loved and protected. Looking at these three children and their relationships with William reveals a pattern of profound emotional neglect and abuse. Michael is ignored until he acts out, then used as a tool. Elizabeth is physically abused and treated as an annoyance, then becomes interesting only once she's dead and possessing an animatronic. The crying child is monitored but not protected, surveilled but not comforted, and his death is observed with clinical interest rather than grief. None of these children receive what children need from a parent: love, attention, protection, guidance, stability. This pattern of neglect and abuse almost certainly reflects what William himself experienced as a child. Adults who are raised with healthy attachment to caregivers, who received appropriate love and boundaries, who felt safe and valued in their families, generally replicate those patterns with their own children. They may not do it perfectly, may make mistakes, but the basic framework of providing care and affection comes naturally, because that's what they experienced. But adults who were neglected or abused as children often struggle to provide what they never received. They may intellectually understand that children need love and attention, but not know how to provide it, because they have no internal model of what that looks like. William's complete inability to emotionally connect with his children, his view of them as objects or inconveniences rather than people worthy of care, his casual disregard for their well-being and even their lives, all suggest someone who never learned how to love because he was never loved himself. A child raised without appropriate attachment, particularly in the first few years of life, can develop what psychologists call reactive attachment disorder. These children grow up unable to form normal emotional bonds, unable to trust others or feel connected to them. As adults, they remain isolated, viewing relationships as transactional rather than emotional, unable to understand or provide the kind of care that most people naturally extend to their own children. If this is what happened to William, if his childhood was marked by absence of love and presence of neglect or abuse, it would explain much about who he became, but it wouldn't excuse it. Many people experience terrible childhoods and don't become serial killers who torture and murder children. Many people with reactive attachment disorder learn to compensate for their deficits, to follow social rules even without emotional investment, to fake the care they can't genuinely feel well enough that their children don't suffer. William didn't do that. Instead, he let his emptiness dictate how he treated his family, and his children paid the price. The Afton household represents the perfect storm of dysfunction. A father incapable of love-raising children who desperately need it. A family held together by biology and circumstance rather than genuine connection. An environment where the children turn on each other for lack of proper parental guidance. A home where death comes for 2 of the 3 children before they reach adulthood, and the surviving child spends his life undead, hunting his father's legacy of horror. It's a family defined by absence, the absence of love, of safety, of all the things that should make a home worth living in. And if William's own childhood was anything like the childhood he created for his sons and daughter, it's no wonder he became a monster. Not because childhood trauma inevitably creates killers, but because growing up without love, without safety, without being valued as a human being, creates people who don't know how to be human to others. The void inside William Afton, that emptiness where empathy and connection should exist, was probably formed in his own childhood, long before he ever became a killer. In a house that might have looked normal from the outside, but inside was as cold and isolated as the household he would create for his own children. The Springlock suits. Where genius met madness, the Springlock suits represent perhaps the most tangible connection between William Afton's brilliance and his horror. These remarkable pieces of engineering, capable of functioning both as performable animatronics and wearable costumes, embody William's technical skill and innovative thinking. But they also reveal his fundamental disregard for human safety and life, his willingness to create beautiful, functional things that carry inherent, deadly danger. Understanding William's relationship with the Springlock suits, particularly the Spring Bonnie costume that would eventually become both his tool for murder and his eternal prison, gives us insight into how his mind works and what his childhood obsessions might have looked like before they matured into adult monstrosity. The Springlock mechanism itself is a genuine innovation, even if it's deeply flawed in its execution. The concept is elegant. Create a system where the animatronic components can be compressed and locked in place using spring locks, creating enough space inside the suit for a human performer to wear it safely. When the performer exits, the locks are released and the internal mechanisms expand back to their functional positions, allowing the suit to operate as a standalone animatronic. This dual functionality would be genuinely useful for a family entertainment venue, allowing performers to interact directly with children while in costume during the day, then having the same suit perform automated routines when needed. The novel trilogy credits William with significant involvement in the Springlock technology's development, though it suggests Henry was the primary innovator, while William contributed to the business and practical implementation. This fits the broader pattern of their partnership. Henry creates the visionary innovations, while William handles making them profitable and practical. But William's engagement with the Springlock suits goes beyond mere business interest. He becomes intimately familiar with how they work, comfortable enough to wear them regularly, and proud of his ability to perform effortlessly while in the dangerous Spring Bonnie costume. Audio training tapes in Five Nights at Freddy's 3 detail the specific dangers of Springlock suits and the protocols that were supposed to keep performers safe. The locks must be wound tightly to maintain compression of the animatronic components. Any loosening of the locks, whether from moisture, damage to the suit, sudden movement, or just time and wear, risks the springs failing and the internal mechanisms snapping back to their original positions with enormous force. This would instantly crush, impale and mutilate anyone wearing the suit. The training emphasizes that even breathing wrong could trigger a failure, that the suits must be handled with extreme care and precision, that mistakes will be fatal. That Fazbear Entertainment would create and deploy such inherently dangerous equipment tells us something about the company's priorities, but it tells us even more about William Afton's mindset in allowing and possibly encouraging their use. A person with normal empathy and concern for others would look at the springlock mechanism and see the risk, would insist on extensive safety measures, and perhaps recommend against using them with human performers at all. But William sees brilliant innovation and a parent is untroubled by the danger it poses to others. The possibility of crushing someone's body inside a suit full of metal and gears doesn't deter him, because others' suffering simply doesn't register as a reason not to do something. We know from both the games and novels that William wore the Spring Bonnie suit regularly and took pride in his ability to do so skillfully. Phone Guy's training tapes mention how one of the performers could wear the suits effortlessly, making it look easy when it was actually extremely difficult and dangerous. This is almost certainly William, who had both the technical understanding to minimize risk and the confidence to perform in the suits, despite knowing what could happen if something went wrong. His comfort in the Spring Bonnie costume was so complete that he could use it not just for entertainment, but for murder, stalking through the pizzeria in this yellow rabbit suit, luring children to their deaths while wearing a mechanism that could kill him at any moment. There's something darkly appropriate about William choosing Spring Bonnie as his murder costume. Bunny rabbits in general are associated with childhood innocence, Easter celebrations, gentleness and friendliness. A yellow bunny, specifically, evokes spring, new life, brightness and cheer. Children would naturally be drawn to this character, would trust someone in this costume, would follow them thinking they're about to experience something fun and special. William understands this psychology perfectly, uses the cultural associations around bunnies to lower children's guards, to make himself seem safe when he's anything but. The costume is a predator's camouflage, and William wears it with complete confidence in its effectiveness, but the springlock suit also becomes William's downfall in the most literal sense. When he returns to the sealed safe room in the abandoned Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location, pursued by the spirits of the children he murdered, he makes a crucial miscalculation. Seeing the withered Spring Bonnie suit leaning against the wall, he laughs and gets inside, thinking it will protect him from the ghosts who have cornered him. He's worn this suit dozens or hundreds of times before. He knows how it works. He's confident in his ability to use it safely, but he doesn't account for the moisture in the air from the leaking ceiling, doesn't consider how long the suit has sat unused, doesn't realize the spring locks have deteriorated beyond the point where they can be safely engaged. The locks fail. The internal mechanisms snap back into place with that crushing force the training tapes warned about. Springs and metal components pierce through William's body, perforating his organs, breaking his bones, destroying his internal structure while leaving him horrifically alive. He deserves this agony, certainly, given what he's done to innocent children. But there's a tragic irony in how the mechanism he helped create and wore with such pride becomes the instrument of his ultimate torture. The Spring Bonnie suit that served him so well as a tool for murder becomes his prison, trapping him in a fusion of flesh and metal, keeping him alive in perpetual agony for decades. This spring lock failure is not William's first, according to various sources. The novel trilogy describes scars all over his body from a previous incident, suggesting he survived an earlier failure that should have killed him. Perhaps this earlier brush with death was part of what sparked his fear of mortality and his eventual obsession with immortality. Perhaps surviving when he should have died gave him a false sense of his own invulnerability, making him overconfident in his ability to control dangerous situations. Either way, the fact that he continued wearing springlock suites after experiencing their failure firsthand demonstrates either remarkable courage or complete dissociation from his own mortality and capacity to feel pain. The springlock suits also tell us something potentially significant about William's childhood and early interests. Engineering of this sophistication doesn't develop overnight. The kind of mechanical aptitude required to create or even competently maintain springlock technology suggests years of practice and study. Starting from a young age, William was probably the kind of child who took things apart to see how they worked, who built mechanical devices from whatever materials he could find, who had an intuitive understanding of how physical systems interact. These are positive traits that many successful engineers and inventors share. But when combined with William's lack of empathy, they become dangerous. Imagine young William, perhaps 10 or 12 years old, fascinated by mechanisms and springs and how pressure can be stored and released. Imagine him creating increasingly complex devices, proud of his skill, seeking recognition for his cleverness. In a healthy childhood with supportive parents, this aptitude would be encouraged and channeled appropriately. He might be given books on engineering, enrolled in technical programs, guided toward productive outlets for his mechanical interests. But if his childhood was marked by neglect or abuse, if his parents didn't care about or actively discouraged his interests, if he had to develop his skills in isolation, then the pride and confidence that should come from parental approval might curdle into arrogance and need for external validation. The springlock suits become William's signature achievement in the world of the games. The innovation most associated with him beyond his general robotic skill. They're brilliant but deeply flawed, useful but deadly, innovative but short-sighted in their design. These characteristics mirror William himself. Brilliant but broken, accomplished but dangerous, innovative in ways that ultimately serve destruction rather than creation. The suits are a perfect metaphor for their creator, beautiful on the outside while harboring mechanisms that kill anyone who gets too close. And just as the springlock suits define William's professional legacy, they also define his personal fate. He wears Spring Bonnie to commit his crimes, hiding behind the cheerful exterior while doing things that should make the costume itself recoil in horror. He dies inside Spring Bonnie, crushed by the mechanisms he understood so well, but couldn't ultimately control. He persists as Springtrap, the fusion of his corpse and the suit, forever trapped in the very technology that gave him so much pride and confidence. His final form is the perfect encapsulation of who he always was, the brilliant facade hiding the rotting horror beneath, the charming exterior containing mechanism designed to harm, the suit that should bring children joy forever contaminated by the man who used it to bring only suffering and death. The first murder, Charlotte Emily. Of all William Afton's crimes, the murder of Charlotte Emily stands apart as perhaps the most significant, not because it's worse than his other killings in any objective sense, but because it represents the inflection point where possibility becomes reality, where whatever darkness lived inside William before crosses the line into action. Charlotte's death is the first murder we know about definitively, the crime that sets everything else in motion, and understanding why William killed Henry Emily's daughter provides crucial insight into his psychology and potentially into the experiences that shaped him into someone capable of such an act. The circumstances of Charlotte's murder are depicted in the puppet minigame from Five Nights at Freddy's 2, and they're devastatingly simple. Charlotte, as a young child, is locked outside Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, separated from the party inside. It's raining. She's vulnerable and alone. William pulls up in his car, gets out, and murders her, leaving her body in the alley beside the building. The security puppet, which Henry created specifically to protect his daughter and programmed to keep her safe inside the building, is trapped by its own programming, initially unable to go outside. By the time it manages to bypass its restrictions and reaches Charlotte in the rain, she's already dead. The puppet collapses beside her, circuits failing from water damage, and Charlotte's spirit possesses it, becoming the entity that will later help the other murdered children possess the animatronics. This sequence of events raises several questions. Was this a planned murder? Or did William simply see an opportunity and act on it? How did Charlotte end up outside alone? Why was the door locked when the security puppet's whole purpose was to protect her? Was William already planning to kill children before this? Or was Charlotte his first, the murder that taught him he could do it and get away with it? The games don't provide explicit answers, but we can make reasonable inferences based on what we know about William and about how opportunity creates crime. Charlotte being outside alone at night suggests either failure of supervision or a moment of distraction by whatever adults were supposed to be watching her. The locked door might have been a security measure gone wrong, or it might have been something William arranged, creating the opportunity by ensuring Charlotte would be separated from help. Either way, William saw a vulnerable child alone outside, and he acted. But why? Why Charlotte specifically, and why at this moment? The most compelling answer, supported by both the games and the novel's characterization of William, is jealousy of Henry Emily. Charlotte is Henry's daughter, the person he loves most, the embodiment of his capacity for human connection. By killing Charlotte, William isn't just committing murder. He's striking at Henry in the most personal way possible, destroying what makes Henry happy, inflicting pain that will never fully heal. This is an act of calculated cruelty aimed at someone William both admires and resents. The novel trilogy makes William's jealousy of Henry explicit through his journals and interior monologue. He wants what Henry has, the creative genius, the stable family, the genuine emotional connections. He documents Henry's life obsessively, studying him like a scientific specimen. And when Charlotte dies, in the novel version, William kidnaps her twin brother Sammy instead. Though the effect on Henry is the same, it destroys his family and changes him fundamentally. The specific target might change between continuities, but the pattern remains. William takes from Henry what William can't have himself, pulls Henry down into grief and loss, makes Henry understand the emptiness William lives with constantly. There's a question of whether William planned to kill Charlotte, or whether he acted impulsively when he saw the opportunity. Serial killers generally fall into categories: organized killers who plan their crimes meticulously, and disorganized killers who act on impulse when opportunity arises. William shows characteristics of an organized killer in his later crimes, particularly the 1985 missing children incident, where he systematically lures and murders 5 children. But Charlotte's murder might have been his first, the moment where impulse met opportunity, and he discovered he was capable of acting on thoughts that had perhaps only been fantasies before. If we imagine William's state of mind leading up to this murder, we might picture someone who's been entertaining dark thoughts for some time. Perhaps he's thought about killing, wondered what it would feel like, considered whether he could do it and get away with it. Perhaps his jealousy of Henry has been building for months or years, resentment compounding into rage beneath his public facade. Perhaps he's reached a point where the emptiness inside him feels unbearable, where he needs to do something, anything, to feel like he has power and control over his circumstances. And then Charlotte is there, alone and vulnerable, and all the thoughts and impulses coalesce into action. The aftermath of Charlotte's murder is almost as significant as the murder itself. William gets away with it. There's apparently no evidence linking him to the crime, or if there is, it's not strong enough to result in prosecution. The restaurant likely closes temporarily or faces scrutiny, but William remains free, unpunished, able to continue his life and his work. This experience of committing murder and suffering no consequences would be powerfully reinforcing. It would teach William that he can do this, that his intelligence and careful planning are sufficient to evade justice, that the thing he thought about and then did is something he can do again. There's also the question of what William felt during and after the murder. For a normal person, killing someone, especially a child, would be accompanied by horror, guilt, empathy for the victim, fear of consequences, moral revulsion at what they've done. These feelings would create enormous psychological pressure that would likely prevent them from killing again, or would drive them to confession and atonement. But William almost certainly felt none of these things. He might have felt a sense of power, of having crossed a line that most people won't cross, of having demonstrated his superiority over normal human moral constraints. He might have felt satisfaction at hurting Henry, at succeeding in his goal. He might have felt intellectual curiosity about the act itself, a clinical interest in his own capacity for violence. But remorse, guilt, empathy, these would require emotional capabilities he doesn't possess. And then something unexpected happens. Charlotte's spirit doesn't simply vanish. It remains, possessing the security puppet, demonstrating that death isn't final, that consciousness can persist in mechanical form. For William, this would be a revelation that completely changes his understanding of what's possible. He didn't just commit murder and get away with it. He committed murder and accidentally discovered something scientifically revolutionary. This possession, this evidence that souls can bind to animatronics, becomes the foundation for everything that follows. All his experiments with Remnant, all his attempts to understand and replicate possession, all his ultimate quest for immortality. Would William have become a serial killer if Charlotte's spirit hadn't possessed the puppet? It's possible he would have killed again simply because he found he could and wanted to. But the possession adds a scientific motivation to what might have been purely sadistic impulse. It transforms murder from merely an expression of power into an experimental methodology, a way to study phenomena that most people don't even believe exist. The children he kills after Charlotte aren't just victims. They're test subjects in his ongoing research into Remnant and possession. The murder of Charlotte Emily is where William Afton crosses from being someone broken and empty and possibly dangerous into being an active destroyer of innocence and life. Whatever he was before this moment, whatever damage his childhood inflicted, or whatever deficits he was born with, they existed as potential rather than reality until he acted. Charlotte's death is the moment where potential becomes actual, where the monster stops being hypothetical and becomes undeniably real. Every death that follows, every child murdered, every soul trapped, every horror William inflicts on the world traces back to this moment in the rain outside Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, when he decided Henry Emily's happiness was something he needed to destroy. And perhaps this tells us something about William's own childhood as well. The specific nature of this crime, targeting a friend's child, attacking through the innocence of family connections, suggests someone whose own sense of family and connection is fundamentally warped. A person raised with healthy attachment and genuine family love would have an instinctive repulsion toward harming a child, especially the child of someone they know and work with. But for William, Charlotte is just an object, a tool he can use to hurt Henry. The absence of any protective instinct, any sense that a child is categorically off limits regardless of what you feel toward the adults in their life, suggests that William himself was never protected, never valued as a child whose innocence deserved guarding. The first murder is always the hardest for serial killers, the moment where they overcome whatever internal resistance they feel toward killing another human being. But for William Afton, if Charlotte was indeed his first victim, that resistance seems to have been minimal. He saw an opportunity, calculated the risks, and acted with apparent ease. The psychological barrier that stops most people from committing murder simply didn't exist for him, or was so weak that he crossed it without significant hesitation. And once crossed, that barrier never rebuilds. Each subsequent murder becomes easier, more routine, until killing children is just another task, clinical and purposeful rather than weighted with moral significance. Charlotte Emily deserved better. She deserved to grow up, to have a life, to pursue whatever interests and dreams a young girl might develop as she matured. Instead, she became the first victim of William Afton's evil, her death setting in motion decades of horror. And while her spirit, as the puppet tries to protect and save the other children, tries to undo some of the damage William caused, the fundamental tragedy remains. A child died in the rain because someone looked at her and saw not a person, but an opportunity, not innocence that deserved protection, but a tool for inflicting pain on someone else. This is what William Afton is at his core. This is what his childhood, whatever it entailed, created. Someone who can look at a child and feel nothing, who can calculate risk and reward and find murder acceptable, who can destroy life without remorse or hesitation. Charlotte's death is where this horror becomes explicit, where the monster reveals itself fully. And every child who died after her, every life he destroyed, every family he shattered, all trace back to this moment when William proved he was willing and capable of the ultimate violation of the innocent. The missing children. Point of no return. If Charlotte Emily's murder was William Afton's first step into explicit monstrosity, the missing children incident of 1985 was his embrace of it fully, the moment where isolated crime became serial killing, where opportunity became methodology, where his dark curiosities transformed into systematic experimentation. 5 children, Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy, walked into Freddy Fazbear's Pizza and never walked out, their bodies hidden in animatronic suits, their souls trapped in metal and endoskeletons, their murderer celebrated by some as a skilled employee and suspected by none until too late. Understanding this incident, the planning and execution and aftermath, gives us perhaps our clearest view of who William Afton had become by his mid-30s, and allows us to theorize about the trajectory that led him from whatever his childhood was to this. The missing children incident is depicted across multiple minigames in Five Nights at Freddy's 2, though the full picture only emerges when you piece together fragments from various sources. Phone Guy's calls reference an incident involving 5 children going missing, a yellow suit being used, an investigation that caused the restaurant to be put on lockdown, and eventually the suspect being cleared due to lack of evidence and the bodies never being found. The minigames show us William, represented by a purple figure, luring children into a back room where they die. Later minigames show the puppet giving gifts to the children, helping their spirits possess the animatronics, Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and Golden Freddy. What's significant about this incident isn't just the murders themselves, but the evidence of planning and methodology they represent. This isn't someone losing control and killing impulsively. This is someone who's developed a system, an approach that allows him to kill multiple children in a public space without being caught. He wears the Spring Bonnie suit to gain the children's trust, uses his knowledge of the restaurant's layout to lead them to areas without camera coverage, employs specific techniques to lure them away from their parents or groups, and has a plan for disposing of the bodies that, while eventually discovered, successfully confuses the investigation enough that he's never definitively proven guilty. Consider the psychological sophistication required for these crimes. William needs to understand child psychology well enough to know what will make them trust him and follow him. He needs to be able to maintain his composure and act naturally, even while surrounded by potential witnesses. He needs to have studied the restaurant security systems well enough to know exactly where the blind spots are. He needs to have planned what to do with the bodies in a way that will delay discovery and make it harder to connect the deaths to any specific person. This level of organization is characteristic of what criminologists call organized offenders, serial killers, who plan their crimes meticulously and leave little evidence behind. But there's more to these murders than just organized crime. There's the element of experimentation. Based on what we know from later law, particularly Sister Location's revelations about Remnant and William's experiments, the 1985 murders weren't just about killing. They were about testing a hypothesis. Charlotte's spirit had possessed the puppet. Could this be replicated? If William deliberately murdered children in proximity to animatronics, would their spirits possess those animatronics just as Charlotte had possessed the puppet? And if so, what could William learn from that about the nature of remnant, of consciousness, of life persisting beyond death? The answer, horrifyingly, is yes, it worked. The 5 children's spirits do possess the animatronics, though we don't know if this happened spontaneously or if the puppet, containing Charlotte's vengeful spirit, facilitated the possessions as the Give Gifts minigame suggests. Either way, William gets his result. Possessed animatronics. Living proof that the Charlotte incident wasn't a fluke. Confirmation that remnant and possession are real, repeatable phenomena. The bodies of 5 dead children transformed into scientific data points in William's ongoing research. The specific children deserve to be remembered as people, not just as names attached to animatronics. Susie, the girl who Gabriel is stated to have been lured with the promise that her dead dog was still alive, that William could show her where it was, demonstrates William's willingness to exploit children's grief and vulnerability for his own purposes. A little girl mourning her pet, desperately wanting to believe it might still be alive, is easy prey for someone who understands exactly which emotional buttons to push. The Fruity Maze minigame depicting this luring is particularly disturbing because it shows William's patience, the way he observes Susie over time, learns about her life, identifies her weakness, and then exploits it with calculated cruelty. Gabriel, Jeremy, Fritz, and Cassidy are less developed as individuals in the canon lore, but that's itself significant. They weren't individuals to William. They were targets, victims, test subjects. He didn't care about who they were as people, what they liked, what their families were like, what potential they had. They were simply available children in the right circumstances, and William took advantage of that availability. This dehumanization of victims is classic psychopathic behavior. The inability to see other people as equally real and important as oneself, reducing them to objects that can be used for one's purposes. The aftermath of the missing children incident demonstrates both William's intelligence and his luck. He's arrested, questioned, but eventually released due to lack of hard evidence. The bodies stuffed inside the animatronics aren't discovered immediately. The suit's mechanisms apparently mask the smell and the visible evidence of death well enough that they can remain in the restaurant, performing on stage with dead children hidden inside them for some period of time before suspicion arises. When investigation eventually leads to the location being shut down, William has already created enough distance between himself and the crimes that he can't be definitively linked to them. But there are hints that people suspect him. Phone Guy's tapes reference someone using a yellow suit from the back room, suggesting William's method was observed or deduced. The company's insistence that the animatronics' behavior is just due to them being on free roaming mode at night, that they're trying to force night guards into suits because they see bare endoskeletons as incomplete, reads as a desperate attempt to explain away the obvious truth that something is deeply wrong with these machines. The spirits trapped inside the animatronics aren't just confused. They're angry, vengeful, actively trying to kill the night guards because they associate adult men in security uniforms with their murderer. This association of the animatronics with their killer, the way the possessed robots specifically target people who remind them of William, creates a secondary tragedy. Guards like Phone Guy, people who had nothing to do with the murders, die because they happen to work in the cursed location, happen to fit the profile of the man who killed these children, happen to be in the wrong place when the vengeful spirits are searching for their murderer. William's crimes ripple outward, claiming additional lives beyond his direct victims, turning a place meant to bring children joy into a death trap for anyone unlucky enough to work there. The missing children incident is William Afton's point of no return. Charlotte's murder might have been an isolated event, a single terrible choice that he could theoretically have stopped with. But systematically murdering 5 children, planning and executing these deaths with calculated precision, demonstrates that William isn't someone who made a mistake or had a moment of weakness. He's a serial killer, someone who kills intentionally and repeatedly, who improves his methodology with each crime, who will almost certainly kill again unless stopped. This is who he is now, fully and completely. And this raises the question of how someone arrives at this point. How does a child, any child, grow into an adult capable of this? The easy answer is that William was born broken, that some genetic anomaly or neurological difference meant he was always going to become this. But that's too simple. Many people lack empathy and don't become serial killers. Many people have the same neurological markers associated with psychopathy and channel those traits into legal pursuits. The specific form that William's evil takes, the focus on children, the use of animatronics and costumes, the transformation of murder into scientific experimentation. All of this suggests experiences and choices that shaped his development. Perhaps young William was obsessed with taking things apart to see how they worked, with understanding mechanisms and systems, and this clinical curiosity extended to wondering what was inside people, what made them work, what would happen if you took them apart the way you might dismantle a broken clock. Perhaps he killed animals as a child, that classic warning sign, and found the experience interesting rather than disturbing, learning early that he could end life without feeling the horror that stops most people. Perhaps he was bullied or abused and learned to associate power with inflicting suffering, developing an addictive need to be the one in control rather than the victim. Or perhaps none of this happened. Perhaps William had a relatively normal childhood and simply lacked something essential from birth, that spark of empathy that connects us to other human beings, and everything that followed was the inevitable result of a person without conscience being given intelligence, opportunity, and the freedom to act on impulses that should remain forever abstract. We can speculate about what might have made him this way, but ultimately the why matters less than the what. What William is, by 1985, is a serial killer of children, someone who has claimed at least 6 lives counting Charlotte, and who will claim more if given the chance. The missing children incident solidifies William Afton's place as Five Nights at Freddy's central horror, the human evil that underlies all the mechanical nightmares. The animatronics are scary because they're inhabited by his victims, because they hunt you because of what he did, because their existence is a constant reminder of innocent lives destroyed. Every game in the series, every location haunted by possessed machines, every spirit that can't rest, all trace back to these murders and the man who committed them. This is William's legacy, not the technical innovations or the business success, but the suffering he inflicted and the cascade of horror that resulted from it. And for anyone wondering what kind of childhood might produce a monster like this, the answer is both simple and inadequate. We don't know. The law doesn't tell us. Perhaps Scott Cawthon believes that some questions are better left unanswered, that trying to explain evil too completely risks rationalizing or excusing it. What we know is that by 1985, when William is likely in his 30s or 40s, he's fully embraced his nature as someone capable of unspeakable cruelty toward the most vulnerable. Whatever happened in his childhood to create this, or whatever didn't happen that should have, the result is undeniable. The missing children incident is where possibility became reality, where a killer's impulse became a killer's identity, where the monster stopped pretending to be human and revealed itself in all its calculated horror. Conclusion: the monster fully formed. We've traced William Afton's known life from co-founding Fazbear Entertainment through his descent into serial murder, from business success to possessing remnant-infused animatronics, from father of 3 to the decomposing nightmare known as Springtrap. We've examined his psychology, his relationships, his crimes, and the question that started this exploration: what created the monster? And now, at the end of our journey through everything we know and everything we can reasonably theorize, we're left with the same uncomfortable truth that's haunted this series from its inception. We don't know. And perhaps more importantly, perhaps intentionally, we're not meant to know. Scott Cawthon made a deliberate choice in crafting William Afton's character. Unlike many fictional villains who are given extensive backstories and tragic origins, meant to help us understand if not sympathize with them, William remains largely opaque before his adult years. We see the monster he became. We see his crimes in detail. We see his relationships and his psychology. But his childhood, those formative years that psychology tells us are so crucial in shaping who we become, stays hidden in shadow. This absence isn't a failure of storytelling. It's a choice, and it's a powerful one. By not giving us William's childhood trauma or explicit origin story, Scott forces us to confront evil without the comfort of explanatory narrative. We want to understand why people do terrible things, because understanding feels like a form of control. If we can point to the moment someone broke, the trauma that created them, the circumstances that made them this way, then we can believe that preventing similar circumstances would prevent similar outcomes. We can believe that monsters are made, not born, and therefore can be unmade or at least not created in the first place. But William Afton doesn't give us that comfort. He's simply evil, fully formed by the time we meet him, with no clear explanation for how he arrived at this state. What we can say with confidence is what William Afton is, regardless of what created him. He's a serial killer who primarily targets children, someone whose complete lack of empathy allows him to manipulate, torture, and murder the most innocent members of society without remorse. He's highly intelligent, skilled at engineering and robotics, capable of creating genuinely innovative technology and using that same intelligence to evade capture for decades. He's charming and manipulative when it serves him, able to present a facade of normalcy that allows him to operate within society, partnering with Henry Emily, running businesses, raising a family, without most people suspecting the horror beneath the surface. He's obsessed with control and with overcoming death, willing to experiment on human souls and consciousness in his quest for immortality. He's incapable of genuine love or connection, viewing even his own children as tools or obstacles rather than people worthy of care. This psychological profile matches what we know about real-world serial killers, particularly those who inspired aspects of William's character like John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Edmund Kemper, and Robert Berchtold. It fits the clinical description of psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder, that constellation of traits that includes superficial charm, grandiose sense of self-worth, lack of remorse or guilt, shallow affect, lack of empathy, failure to accept responsibility for actions, and impulsivity combined with cunning. These traits typically have their roots in childhood, whether through genetic predisposition, neurological differences, traumatic experiences, or more likely, some combination of all three. If we try to construct a plausible childhood for William Afton, based on what we know about his adult psychology, it might look something like this. A child born with neurological differences that made normal empathy and emotional connection difficult or impossible. Perhaps genetic factors that predisposed him towards psychopathy. Parents who were either actively abusive or more likely emotionally absent and neglectful, failing to provide the kind of early attachment and bonding that allows children to develop conscience and empathy. Intelligence that manifested early, making him different from other children, isolated by interests and capabilities that his peers couldn't share. Fascination with mechanisms and how things work, possibly extending to cruelty toward animals as he explored the boundary between life and death. Social difficulties stemming from his inability to form genuine connections, either manifesting as complete isolation or as learned mimicry of social behaviors without understanding the emotions behind them. And underlying all of this, that fundamental emptiness, that void where love and connection should exist, that sense of being fundamentally separate from and perhaps superior to other human beings. But this is speculation. informed speculation based on psychology and real-world patterns, but speculation nonetheless. The canonical William Afton could have had a childhood nothing like this. He could have been raised by loving parents in a stable home and simply been born without the capacity for empathy, nature overwhelming any positive influence of nurture. Or he could have experienced trauma so severe that it fundamentally broke something that should be unbreakable, though this seems less likely given that his crimes show planning and intelligence rather than the kind of chaotic rage that often characterizes people reacting to trauma. The truth is we don't know, and Scott Cawthon has given no indication that we'll ever be told definitively. What we do know is that by the time William Afton enters the explicit timeline, partnering with Henry Emily to found Fazbear Entertainment in the 1970s, he's already fully formed as the monster he'll be for the rest of his existence. His lack of empathy is already complete. His capacity for manipulation is already developed. His technical skills are already substantial. His jealousy of Henry, his problematic relationship with his family, his willingness to create dangerous innovations without adequate safety consideration, all of it is present from the beginning of what we see. Whatever path led him to this point is complete. He's not still developing into a killer. He already is one, just waiting for opportunity to manifest explicitly. And this is perhaps the most important insight we can take from examining William Afton's character and theorizing about his origins. Evil doesn't always have a satisfying origin story. Monsters don't always have a clear moment of creation that we can point to and say, there, that's when they broke. Sometimes people are simply born or raised, or somehow developed into individuals fundamentally incapable of human connection. And once they reach adulthood, once they have the opportunity and means to act on impulses that should remain abstract, they become destroyers of innocence and life. William Afton didn't become a monster because of any single childhood trauma we can identify. He became a monster because something was missing or broken in him, whether from birth or early development, that allowed him to view other human beings instrumentally rather than as people worthy of consideration and care. This absence, this void where empathy should exist, combined with high intelligence and opportunity to create the perfect storm of a serial killer who could operate for decades while maintaining a facade of respectability. The question, what created the monster, might not have a satisfying answer, but perhaps that's appropriate for a horror franchise. Real horror isn't always explicable. Real evil doesn't always make sense. And by leaving William's origins mysterious, Scott Cawthon created a villain more unsettling than any amount of backstory could make him. We're left with the knowledge that someone can walk among us, can be our business partner or neighbor, or the person running the children's entertainment venue. And beneath that normal exterior can hide something so fundamentally broken that they're capable of unthinkable cruelty. That's the real horror of William Afton. Not that we don't know what created him, but that we can't identify him before he acts. Can't see the monster until it's already too late. For those of you who've stayed with me through this exploration, whether actively listening or drifting in and out as sleep takes hold, I hope this has deepened your understanding of Five Nights at Freddy's most compelling character. William Afton is fascinating not despite his incompleteness, but because of it. Not despite the unanswered questions, but because of them. He represents a kind of evil that's both extraordinarily rare and terrifyingly real, the kind that can hide behind success and charm and intelligence. That doesn't announce itself with obvious warning signs. That only reveals its true nature when it's already claimed victims. As we close this examination, one thing is clear. William Afton is who he is, fully and completely. Whether his childhood was marked by trauma or neglect, or simply the absence of something that should be present, whether he was born this way or made this way, or some combination thereof, the result is the same. A brilliant mind without conscience, a charming facade hiding emptiness, a technical innovator whose creations serve destruction, a father incapable of love, a serial killer of children, a man so afraid of death that he'll destroy countless lives in his quest to overcome it, a monster in human form who eventually becomes a literal monster, trapped in the suit he wore to commit his crimes, unable to die, unable to truly live, existing in eternal torment that he brought upon himself. And perhaps that's the closest thing to justice this story offers. William sought immortality and achieved it, but the eternal existence he craved turned out to be an endless cycle of agony, his body destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again, his consciousness fragmented and preserved in various tormented forms. He wanted to never die, and he got his wish, but forever turned out to be its own kind of death, more complete than any ending could be. The man who couldn't understand or care about others' suffering became trapped in his own, a fitting conclusion to the story of someone who created so much horror that the universe itself seems to have rejected his death, forcing him to persist as a reminder and a warning. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the psychology and origins of William Afton, please consider liking and subscribing. Let me know in the comments what aspects of Five Nights at Freddy's lore you'd like to explore next. Whether it's other characters' backstories, deeper analysis of specific incidents, or examination of the game's themes and symbolism, I'm here to create the kind of atmospheric, comprehensive exploration that helps you understand this franchise better, whether you're actively engaging or letting it wash over you as you drift towards sleep. Thank you for spending these hours with me in the shadows of William Afton's incomplete past, examining the fragments we have and theorizing about what might fill the gaps. The monster remains mysterious, his origins hidden, his childhood unknown. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be. Some questions are meant to linger unanswered. Some darkness is better left unexplored. Some monsters need no explanation beyond the horror of their existence and the suffering they caused. William Afton is all of these things. An understanding that sometimes evil simply exists without satisfying explanation or clear origin might be the most important lesson Five Nights at Freddy's has to teach us. Sleep well.